What's up everyone, welcome to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Harry Potter inherited Merlin's lost magic, part 1. So before we start, please subscribe to our channel, and like this video, so let's begin the video. The morning that Harry Potter turned 11 was the same morning that a crow landed on the roof of number 4, Privet Drive, and refused to leave. Vernon Dursley noticed it first. He was standing at the kitchen window with his mug of tea, watching the street the way he always did, as though the neighborhood were a problem he was trying to solve. The crow sat on the peak of the roof directly above the boy's bedroom window, and it stared down at the garden with eyes that were too still, too knowing, for any ordinary bird. Vernon told himself it was nothing. He told himself that crows were common enough, that they meant nothing, that the flicker he had seen in the kitchen light when Harry walked in for breakfast was a loose bulb and nothing more. He told himself these things because Vernon Dursley was a man who had built his entire life around not believing in the things he could not explain. But the crow stayed. It stayed through breakfast, through the argument about Harry's school uniform, through Dudley's birthday planning conversation that took up most of the table and most of the air in the room. It stayed while Harry sat in his usual corner of the table eating his toast in silence, his green eyes distant and unfocused, watching something that was not quite in the room, or perhaps watching something that was everywhere in the room, and invisible to everyone else. Harry himself did not notice the crow. He was thinking about the dream. It was always the same dream, or almost always. He stood in a forest so old that the trees had grown together overhead into a single continuous ceiling of bark and leaf, shutting out the sky entirely. The ground beneath his feet was not dirt. It was stone, ancient stone worn smooth by water and time, carved with lines that were not quite letters and not quite pictures and something in between, that he could almost read the way you almost remembered a word that had slipped your mind. The air in the dream smelled like rain and iron and something else, something green and alive and deep, the smell of earth that had never seen the sun. In the dream he was not afraid. That was the strangest part. He was 11 years old and standing alone in a dark forest, and he was not afraid at all. He was waiting. He had always been waiting, in the dream, for something that was already on its way to him, moving through the dark between the trees with a sound like pages turning and a light that was not light so much as the absence of darkness. Then he always woke up. He woke up that morning to Aunt Petunia's voice outside his cupboard door, sharp and impatient, telling him to get up before she counted to 3, and the dream dissolved the way dreams did, leaving only the smell behind, that green iron rain smell, clinging to the inside of his nose like a memory his body had carried home from somewhere it had been without him. He got dressed in the dark. He had been getting dressed in the dark for as long as he could remember, because the cupboard under the stairs had no light switch, only a bare bulb overhead with a chain that you had to reach up and pull, and Harry had broken it once by accident when he was 7, and the bulb had shattered without being touched, just shattered all at once when he reached for it in his sleep. And Uncle Vernon had taken the replacement bulb away after that as a punishment, and never given it back. So Harry dressed in the dark and navigated by feel and by the thin strip of light that came under the door from the hallway, and he was very good at it by now. He climbed out of the cupboard and stood in the hallway and stretched his back and looked at the door to the kitchen and thought, for one clear second, that he could feel something moving in the house. Not footsteps. Not the sounds of the Dursleys waking up. Something else, a kind of pressure in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the sky went very still and the birds stopped singing. It lasted only a second. Then Dudley came barreling down the stairs above him, and the feeling was gone. Dudley stopped on the bottom step and looked at Harry with the particular expression he wore when he was deciding whether to say something cruel or simply push past him. Today he said nothing. He looked at Harry for a moment with something almost like unease, almost like the expression people wore when they stepped into a room, and could not immediately tell what was wrong with it, and then he pushed past and went into the kitchen, and the moment was over. Harry stood in the hallway alone for a moment longer. He put his hand against the wall beside the cupboard door, and felt the plaster under his fingers, and the plaster was warm. Not the warmth of a house that had been heated overnight, but a different warmth, a warmth that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the wall, a warmth that pulsed, very faintly, like a heartbeat. He pulled his hand away. He went into the kitchen. He sat down at his corner of the table and ate his toast and said nothing, and the crow sat on the roof above him and did not move. The letter came at 9:30. Harry was in the garden, because the garden was the only place he was allowed to be on Dudley's birthday that did not involve performing some task for Aunt Petunia. The garden was technically a punishment location, assigned to him, while the Dursleys planned the afternoon's birthday outing without him, but Harry had come to prefer the garden to the house. The garden had old things in it. An oak tree in the far corner that was older than the house by 100 years or more, its roots buckling the garden wall and its canopy throwing deep shade over the overgrown corner that Aunt Petunia's ornamental plants had never reached. Ivy climbing the back fence with a patient thoroughness that reminded Harry of something he could not name. Moss on the stones of the garden path, bright and very green, that came back every spring, no matter how many times Uncle Vernon scraped it away. Harry was sitting under the oak tree with his knees drawn up to his chest, not thinking about anything in particular, when the letter came through the front door. He heard the slot rattle. He heard Aunt Petunia's footsteps crossing the hall. He heard the sound she made when she picked up the post, a small competent sorting sound, letters for Vernon, letters for Dudley, catalogs for Petunia, and then silence. A silence that lasted longer than usual. A silence that had a texture to it, thick and strange, the same texture as the pressure he had felt in the house that morning. He did not know why he got up. He did not know why he walked back inside, trailing mud from the garden path across the kitchen floor that he would have to clean later. He came through the kitchen and into the hall, and he saw Aunt Petunia standing very still beside the front door with a letter in her hand and her face the color of old chalk. She looked up when he came in. Her eyes went to his face and then away again, away and up, as though she could not quite bring herself to look at him directly, the way people avoided looking at something that was too bright or too wrong for their eye. She held the letter out to him without saying anything. He took it. The envelope was thick and heavy, made of paper that felt slightly different from ordinary paper, slightly more real, the way some things felt more real than the things around them, for reasons you could not articulate. His name was on the front in green ink, written in handwriting that was precise and slightly archaic. The letters formed with a care that people had stopped taking with handwriting sometime around the invention of typewriters. Mr. H. Potter, it said. The cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He looked at the address. He looked at the way it said cupboard under the stairs with the same matter-of-fact precision as a letter addressed to a perfectly ordinary room in a perfectly ordinary house, and he felt something move through him that was not quite anger, and not quite sadness and not quite surprise, but somewhere in the region of all three. He turned the envelope over. The seal on the back was wax, dark red, pressed with a crest he did not recognize at first. A lion, an eagle, a badger, and a serpent arranged around a large letter H. Below the crest were words in Latin that he could not read. He pressed his thumb against the wax and felt it, and the wax was warm, the same warm as the wall beside the cupboard, the same pulse, almost imperceptible, like a distant heartbeat felt through stone. He broke the seal and opened the letter. He read it. He read it twice. He read it a third time standing in the hall of number 4 Privet Drive, while his Aunt Petunia watched him with her hands pressed flat against her skirt, as though she needed to hold herself upright. The letter informed him that he had been accepted to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. It listed the supplies he would need. It told him that a representative would come to assist him with arrangements. It wished him well in what it called his coming journey, and something about that phrasing struck him as strange, as if the journey it was referring to was more than a train ride to Scotland. He lowered the letter and looked at his aunt. She looked back at him. Her face was still chalk white, but something was moving behind her eyes, something complicated and old, something she had been carrying for a long time, and was very tired of carrying. She said, very quietly, that she supposed they had always known it would come to this. He said nothing. He waited. She said that his mother had been one of them, and that she had tried to keep him away from all of it, and that apparently all of it had refused to stay away. She said this with a bitterness that was not quite directed at him, the bitterness of someone who had been in a battle for a long time, and had just received news that they had lost. He thought about asking her what his mother had been like. He thought about asking her what she had known and for how long, and what she had told herself in the years when she had not told him. He thought about all of these things, and he said none of them, because he could see that she was at the very edge of something, and pushing her past that edge would not give him the answers he wanted. He folded the letter back into his envelope. He went back outside to the garden. He sat under the oak tree with the letter in his hands, and he looked at the seal, and the seal looked back at him. The 4 creatures arranged in their eternal positions around that central letter, and something about the arrangement tugged at the dream, at the stone floor carved with its half letters and half pictures, and he could not say why. The crow was still on the roof. He could see it from where he sat, a dark shape against the white sky, still and watching. He looked at it for a moment and it looked at him, and then it spread its wings and lifted off the roof with a sound like a single page being turned, and flew away north, and was gone. He watched it until it disappeared. He looked down at the letter in his hands. He said, very quietly to himself and to the old oak tree and to the moss on the garden path, that everything was about to change. He was right. But he did not yet understand in how many directions the change would go, or how many layers it had, or how far down the roots of it went. He did not yet understand that the letter from Hogwarts was the smallest and most ordinary part of what was happening to him, the visible tip of something enormous and old and patient that had been waiting for him since long before he was born. He did not yet understand any of that. He was 11 years old, sitting under a tree in a garden in Surrey, and he had just learned that magic was real. It was enough for now. The rest would come. The Hogwarts representative arrived 3 days later. Harry had expected something dramatic. He had spent 3 days expecting something dramatic, lying in his cupboard at night, listening to the Dursleys argue about what was to be done, hearing Uncle Vernon's red-faced certainty that no nephew of his was going to any school for freaks, hearing Aunt Petunia's quieter and somehow more frightening responses, the low voice she used when she had already decided something, and was simply waiting for Vernon to stop objecting. 3 days of that, and of Dudley's theatrical disgust at the idea of having a wizard cousin, and of the strange things that kept happening around the house, the lights flickering when Harry walked into a room, the water in the kitchen tap running warm when it should have been cold and cold when he expected warm, the small and inexplicable failures of ordinary reality that Harry had been living with his whole life, and was only now beginning to understand. The representative was not dramatic. She knocked on the front door at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning, a small woman with iron gray hair and square-framed spectacles, wearing robes of a deep bottle green that she had made no attempt to disguise with ordinary clothes. She carried a briefcase. She stood on the doorstep of number 4, with the precise upright bearing of someone who had delivered difficult news to difficult people many times before, and found it bracing. Her name, she told a frozen Vernon Dursley, was Professor Minerva McGonagall, and she was deputy headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and she was here to speak with Harry Potter about his enrollment. Vernon attempted to tell her that there had been a mistake, and that Harry would not be attending any such school. Professor McGonagall looked at him over the rims of her spectacles, with an expression that contained, somehow, the complete history of every wizard parent and guardian who had ever made that argument to her, and a complete record of how all of those arguments had ended. She said that she quite understood his position, and that she would like to come in and discuss it over tea. She was inside and seated at the kitchen table before Vernon had finished forming his next sentence. Harry sat across from her and watched her and tried to work out what he was seeing. She was old, but old in the way that certain things were old. The way the oak tree in the garden was old, with a quality that was not weakness but depth, a sense that there was a great deal more of her than was immediately visible. Her eyes behind the spectacles were very sharp and very clear, and when she looked at Harry, she did not look at him the way most adults looked at him, as a problem or a charity case or an obligation. She looked at him the way you looked at a thing you were genuinely curious about. She said, after the tea was made and Vernon had been maneuvered into his chair with the efficiency of someone herding a large and uncertain animal, that she would like to speak with Harry directly if the Dursleys had no objection. Vernon had a great many objections. Professor McGonagall listened to them with what Harry would later come to recognize as her particular form of patience, which was not soft patience but structural patience, the patience of stone, the patience of something that would be standing long after the noise had stopped. Then she spoke to Harry. She told him about Hogwarts. She told him about the houses, Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, Slytherin, and their different characters and histories. She told him about the curriculum, the subjects he would study, the different forms of magic he would learn. She told him about Diagon Alley, where he could purchase his supplies, and about Gringotts, the bank, where a vault had been maintained in his name by his parents. Harry listened. He had many questions and he kept most of them, because he could see that the full list would take longer than the available morning, and he had learned a long time ago to be strategic about the questions he asked, and when he asked them. He asked about the vault. He asked about what happened if he struggled with a particular subject. He asked whether there was a library. Professor McGonagall said that there was quite an extensive library, and something shifted in her expression when she said it, a small adjustment that Harry could not immediately identify. Not quite surprise. Not quite the look people gave him when he said something unexpected. Something more careful than that. She said that Hogwarts had one of the oldest and most comprehensive magical libraries in Britain, and that students were encouraged to use it extensively, though some sections were restricted. Harry nodded. He filed this way. She gave him a sheet of paper with a list of the materials he would need, and instructions for getting to Diagon Alley. She told him that as a child of magical heritage who had grown up without access to the magical world, the school had provisions to help him obtain what he needed. She looked at Vernon when she said this in a way that suggested she was aware of the precise nature of the provisions that had been made for Harry's comfort over the last decade. Vernon made a noise. Petunia pressed her lips together. Dudley had left the room some time ago, apparently finding the whole situation too confusing to be entertaining. Professor McGonagall rose to leave. She paused in the kitchen doorway and looked back at Harry one more time with that careful look, the look he could not quite categorize. She said that she hoped he would find Hogwarts to be a home. She said it simply, without the performative warmth that adults sometimes use when they said things they felt they should say. She said it like a thing that she meant, and then she left. Harry sat at the kitchen table with the supply list in his hands, and listened to the front door close and the sound of the street outside, ordinary and unchanged, and thought about the word she had used, home. He turned it over in his mind the way he turned over the seal on the letter, feeling its shape, testing its weight. He thought he might understand, someday, why she had chosen that word. He did not understand it yet. He looked down at the supply list. He read through the items: wand, cauldron, robes, standard book of spells, grade 1. Books on various subjects, transfiguration and potions and history of magic and others. At the bottom of the list, below all the required items, there was a single additional line that had not been on the standard supply list she had handed him, a line added by hand in the same precise green ink as his letter. He read it several times to make sure he was reading it correctly. It said, "A visit to the restricted section entrance, level 4, will be arranged for you upon arrival. Please do not mention this to other students." He looked at the line for a long time. Then he turned the paper over, checked the back, found nothing, and turned it back again. The line was still there. He folded the list carefully and put it in the pocket of his oversized jeans. He went to his cupboard. He sat on his bed in the dark and thought about the dream, about the stone floor and the carved lines and the green iron smell of rain. He thought about the pressure in the air and the warmth in the wall. He thought about the crow. He thought about the fact that Professor McGonagall, who had said everything else she had to say with the brisk efficiency of someone running through a checklist, had paused in the doorway to look at him one more time before she left. He thought that there were things she knew about him that she had not said. He thought that he would very much like to find out what they were. He was 11 years old and patient and very good at waiting. Diagon Alley was, in Harry's considered opinion, the most remarkable place he had ever been. He went alone. Aunt Petunia had been given instructions and money, the latter from an envelope that Professor McGonagall had left with quiet authority on the kitchen table before departing, and she had provided Harry with directions to the Leaky Cauldron in London, and then closed the subject by closing herself in the living room, and turning the television up loud enough that he did not have to hear the sound of her thinking about it. He took the bus to London. He sat on the upper deck with his supply list in his hands, and watched the city accumulate around him as the bus moved inward from the suburbs, the buildings growing denser and older, and he thought about what it meant, that there was a whole world hidden inside the world he already knew. He thought about it the way he thought about the dream, not with surprise exactly, but with a sense of recognition, the feeling of remembering something you had not known you had forgotten. The Leaky Cauldron was a dark pub squashed between a large bookshop and a record shop, visible only if you were looking for it, the eye sliding past it if you were not, the way the eye slid past certain kinds of truth when the mind was not prepared for them. Harry pushed open the door and stood inside, and let his eyes adjust and felt, for the third time in a week, that particular pressure in the air, stronger here than anywhere he had been before, the pressure of magic in a place where magic was practiced openly. The barman was a man called Tom, very old, very bent, very affable, who recognized Harry immediately, and called everyone's attention to him in a way that Harry found deeply uncomfortable. He had not yet learned to receive attention gracefully, had spent his whole life learning to be unnoticed instead, and the sudden weight of all those eyes was too much and not enough at the same time, too much sensation and not enough information. He managed it by saying very little and following Tom through the pub to the back, to the small courtyard with the ancient brick wall, and watching Tom count the bricks and tap them with his wand in the practiced sequence that opened the wall into Diagon Alley. The wall opened. Harry stepped through. He stood at the top of the alley and felt it hit him all at once, the noise and the light and the smell of it, cauldrons and parchment and strange smoke from shops he could not yet name, people in robes of every color moving in every direction, owls in cages in windows and cats winding around legs and toads in buckets by a pet shop door, and above everything the particular charged quality of the air, the magic so dense here that it was almost visible, almost a color. Something in the upper range of purple, something at the edge of the spectrum the human eye was not quite built to see. He walked down the alley slowly. He let himself take it in without trying to process it all at once, the way you looked at a very large painting, giving different parts of it your attention before trying to understand the whole. He passed a shop with rotating models of planets in the window. He passed a place that sold self-writing quills in 30 colors. He passed what appeared to be an apothecary with bundles of dried things hanging in the door, and a smell that was earthy and complex, and not entirely pleasant. He went to Gringotts first because the letter had instructed him to, and because the bank dominated the end of the alley in a way that demanded acknowledgement. The goblins unnerved him slightly, not in a fearful way, but in the way that things unnerved him when they were more intelligent than they were letting on, which was a feeling he recognized from dealing with teachers who underestimated him. He sat in the cart as it plunged down into the vaults, and felt the deep rock around him, and felt, again, that warmth, that pulse, not the same as the wall at Privet Drive but related to it, the same family of sensation, like hearing the same note played on different instruments. He did not say anything about this. He collected his money from the vault, which was smaller than the Dursleys' vault apparently, but still contained enough gold to make him understand for the first time that he was not, technically speaking, poor, and he went back up to the surface and thanked the goblin and went back out into the alley. He bought his books first. He had always bought his books first, when he was allowed books at all, from the second-hand stalls at the school fair or the one trip to the library every half-term that Aunt Petunia permitted. He went to Flourish and Blots and collected the books on his list, and then stood in the shop for a while just breathing in the smell of it, old parchment and new binding glue, and the faint smokiness of books that had absorbed years of magical use. He asked the shopkeeper, a middle-aged witch with ink on her fingers, and the comfortable authority of someone who had been surrounded by books so long, they had become an extension of her personality, whether there were any books about the history of magic that were not on the standard school list. She looked at him over the stacks of his purchases and tilted her head in the way that people tilted their heads when a question was more interesting than they had expected. She said that there was quite a section, actually, though much of the older material was difficult reading. He said that he did not mind difficult reading. She gave him a look, a brief assessor's look, the kind that concluded rapidly and accurately. She recommended 3 books. A history of pre-Roman magical practice in Britain, a survey of medieval wandless magic traditions, and a slim, very old volume in a worn brown cover with no title on the spine, which she described as an account of the early Hogwarts period written by someone who had apparently been there. He bought all 3. He bought them without hesitation, spending money that still felt faintly unreal, because it had been unreal until 3 days ago, and he carried the heavy bag to the next shop and the next. He saved Ollivanders for last. He had read the name on every other wand he had seen mentioned in the books on his list, Ollivanders, makers of fine wands since 382 BC, and something about the date had lodged in his mind, that precise ancient date, that confidence stretching back into a history so old, that most of what Britain had been in 382 BC was lost. He pushed open the door of the narrow shop, and the bell rang overhead, and the feeling hit him like a physical thing. It was the pressure, the same pressure he had felt in the house and at the leaky cauldron and in the vault, but here it was different, concentrated and complex. The way a perfume was complex when you were standing inside the shop that sold it, rather than catching a trace of it from a distance. The shop was full of wands, he could feel them, the narrow boxes stacked in their thousands on the narrow shelves going back into the shadows of the shop, and each one was not quite silent, each one was doing something very faint and very continuous, that his ordinary senses could not quite catch, but that something else in him could, something that was not his five senses, but was adjacent to them, present alongside them. The something that had been pulsing in walls and warming beneath his hands and turning his ordinary world slightly sideways all his life. He stood very still inside the door. An old man appeared from between the shelves. He was very old, very slight, with pale eyes that caught the shop's low light, and held it longer than eyes usually did. He stopped when he saw Harry, in the way that people stopped when they saw something they had been expecting, but whose arrival still required a moment's adjustment. He said, very quietly, "Harry Potter." Harry said yes. The old man, Ollivander, moved toward him, and there was something in the way he moved that Harry filed carefully away, the same something he had filed away about the line at the bottom of his supply list, and about the look in Professor McGonagall's eyes in the kitchen doorway. The something was knowledge. The particular movement of someone who knew more than they were about to say. Ollivander measured him with a tape measure that worked by itself, noted the results, disappeared into the shelves, and returned with the box. He explained, as he worked through the process of matching a wand to a wizard, about the cores and the woods and the logic of it, the idea that the wand chose the wizard, not the other way around. Harry tried 7 wands. He tried 12. He tried 19. He was aware, as the number mounted, that this was not the ordinary experience, that something about his particular whatever it was making the process difficult, not because the wands rejected him exactly, but because something in him was too much for them, the way a river was too much for a cup. The wands responded, but wrong, sparks that were too bright, a gust of wind that was not expected, a sound he could not identify coming briefly from somewhere that was not the shop. Ollivander was watching him with those pale eyes and saying nothing but noticing everything, with the dedicated attention of someone who had seen many unusual things, and knew how to observe without disturbing. On the 23rd attempt, Harry picked up a wand of holly, 11 inches, with a phoenix feather core, and the shop went very quiet. Not quiet as in silence, quiet as in everything paused. The dust in the air stopped moving. The light steadied. The continuous faint not quite sound from the shelves of wands settled into a single low note, like a chord resolved. The warmth traveled up his arm. Not the wall warmth, not the vault warmth. Different. Warmer. Like putting your hand into sunlight after standing in the shade for a very long time. He lowered the wand. He looked at it. It looked ordinary. Smooth pale wood, a slight give to it, the length of his forearm. Ollivander was watching him with an expression that was not quite any of the expressions Harry had a name for. He said, very softly, that it was curious. Very curious. Harry waited. Ollivander said that the phoenix who gave the feather for this wand gave only one other feather, and that the wand made from that other feather had done great and terrible things, and that Harry himself was the famous Harry Potter, and that Harry was destined for great things too. He could feel it. Harry held the wand and thought about this. He thought about the word destined, and he thought about the dream, and he thought about the pulse in walls and the warmth in stone and the crow on the roof. He thought about the line at the bottom of his supply list. He thought about Ollivander's face and the specific configuration of knowledge and concern that he could see there. He said, carefully, that he supposed he would have to work hard then. Ollivander blinked. He looked at Harry for a moment with the focused attention of someone recalibrating, and then he said, yes, he supposed Harry would. Harry paid for the wand and left the shop. He stood on the cobblestones of Diagon Alley with the one box in his bag and all his books and his cauldron and his robes and everything he needed for the world he was entering, and he stood there for a moment in the noise and color of the alley, and felt the pressure of the magic around him, dense and constant, and he held himself very still in the middle of it. He thought about the line on the supply list, the restricted section entrance, level 4. He thought about the fact that in all of Ollivander's careful and knowing speech, in all the build-up about the wand and its twin and destiny, the old man had not said anything about the thing Harry had felt when he picked it up. Not the warmth, not the quiet, not the way the shop had held its breath. He had said nothing about any of that, which meant either he had not noticed it, or he had, and had decided not to mention it. Harry walked back down Diagon Alley through the crowd. He stepped back through the archway and the brick wall, back into the ordinary courtyard of the leaky cauldron, and the pressure dropped behind him like a sound cut off, and the ordinary world assembled itself around him again, grey and particular and real. He thought that it was probably the second option. He thought that there were a great many things that were being carefully not mentioned. He caught the bus back to Surrey with his bags across his lap, and the one box resting on top of everything, and he sat with his chin on his hand, and watched London dissolve back into suburbs, and thought about all the things that careful people were being careful not to say. The weeks between the letter and the 1st of September were the longest of Harry's life, and also, in a way, the most useful. He read. He had always read, in the way of children who have a great deal of time alone and access to libraries, but he had never had material this interesting before. He read his school textbooks through once and then again, marking the things that confused him, the gaps in explanations, the places where a concept seemed to have more to it than the standard text acknowledged. He read the 3 books he had bought on his own in flourish and blots, the history of pre-Roman magic, and the survey of wandless traditions, and the slim anonymous account of early Hogwarts. It was the last of these that changed things. He found it on the 3rd night of reading, sitting on the mattress in his cupboard with a torch, which was a system he had perfected over years, and which involved a specific angle of the torch, and a specific position of his body, that kept the light from showing under the door. The slim brown book had seemed, at first, like a straightforward historical text, an account of the founding of Hogwarts by its 4 founders, the consolidation of the British magical community, the establishment of traditions that persisted to Harry's day. But in the 6th chapter, which concerned itself with what the anonymous author called the prior tradition, the account changed. The prior tradition, the author wrote, referred to the forms of magical practice that predated the wand-based system formalized by the founders. It was a tradition that the founders themselves had studied before establishing their school, and that 3 of the 4 had decided to leave behind in the interests of creating a magical education system that could be safely taught to the young and consistently applied across different practitioners. The 4th, the author noted without naming the 4th, had disagreed with this decision, had argued that the prior tradition should be preserved, or at least documented, had left the founding collaboration before Hogwarts opened. The prior tradition was described, in careful terms that nonetheless managed to convey the author's personal law, as a form of magic that predated wands and predated formal spellwork, and predated, effectively, the entire structure of magical thought that Harry was about to spend 7 years learning. It was described as a magic tied to what the author called the deep structure of the world, the underlying rules by which reality organized itself, rules which could be perceived and, by certain practitioners, adjusted. It did not require words or gestures or focus points in the way that modern magic required them. It required instead a quality that the author struggled to name and finally called presence, the full and complete attention of a practitioner who had learned to perceive the deep structure, and to hold it steady in their awareness while acting within it. Harry read this passage 4 times. He sat in his cupboard with the torch in his hand and reread it, and thought about the pulsing walls and the warmth in stone, and the way the Ollivander's shop had gone quiet around him. He turned the page. The chapter continued with a discussion of the last known practitioner of the prior tradition, who was described as a figure of enormous power and enormous ambiguity, someone who had shaped the early magical world in ways that were still not entirely understood. This practitioner, the author wrote, had been the teacher of all 4 Hogwarts founders before they founded anything, had been the person who made the magical world they built possible, and had spent the later part of his life attempting to preserve what the founders had chosen to abandon. The practitioner's name was not stated in the text. Where the name should have appeared, in the places the grammar of the sentence required it, there was instead a faint watermark shape in the page, an impression as if something had been written there and then removed, not scratched out or painted over, but removed at a level below the paper's surface, as though the name had been unlaid from the text, rather than erased from it. Harry pressed his finger against one of these impressions. The paper was very slightly warm. He sat with his hand on the warm paper in his dark cupboard and thought about that. He thought about the restricted section, level 4. He thought about what was buried, and why. He turned off the torch and lay down on his mattress in the dark, and the dream was already waiting for him, the stone floor and the carved half-letters, and the green smell of ancient rain, and in the dream he walked forward toward the light that was not light, but the absence of darkness, and the carved lines on the floor resolved, just for a moment, just at the edge of recognition, into a name. He woke before he could read it. He lay in the dark and stared at the underside of the stairs above him and breathed. September 1st arrived the way significant dates always arrived, announced by the feeling that something was tilting in the world, some long slow lean of events, finally reaching its angle of collapse. Uncle Vernon drove him to King's Cross in silence of the specific variety that meant there was a great deal being deliberately not said. Harry sat in the back seat with Hedwig's cage on the seat beside him, the owl he had bought on impulse in the magical menagerie, a white owl who had looked at him from her cage, with the same quality of patient recognition that he was beginning to associate with things that belonged to his particular world. Hedwig was sleeping, or pretending to sleep, with the dignity of a creature that had decided to conserve her energy for things that mattered. Harry had packed his trunk carefully, organizing it with the same methodical precision that he had applied to every problem in his life, where organization was something he could control. His school materials on top. His 3 private books at the bottom, wrapped in an old jumper. his supply list in the inner pocket of his school robes. King's Cross was crowded in the particular way of large stations, a constant movement of people in all directions without apparent coordination, and Harry navigated it by feel, the way he navigated most things. Vernon pointed out platforms 9 and 10 and said, with what might have been a trace of something other than contempt, if contempt had not been Vernon's default setting, that platform 9 and 3/4 was not a real place. Harry said thank you and meant it, which confused Vernon enough that he left without incident. Harry stood with his trolley between platforms 9 and 10, and looked at the barrier and thought about it. He looked at the barrier the way he had looked at the line at the bottom of his supply list, and a warm watermark on the page of his old book, with the specific attention he had developed for things that were pretending to be more solid than they were. He walked through. He did not run. He walked through steadily and the barrier admitted him and he came out on the other side into a world of steam and scarlet, the Hogwarts Express enormous and gleaming at the platform, and the platform itself crowded with families and owls and cats, and the general cheerful chaos of a beginning. He stood for a moment and let himself feel it, the pressure here stronger again than in the Muggle world, and beneath the pressure something else, something familiar. The deep structure warmth, very faint, as though the world here was slightly more itself than it was on the other side of the barrier. He loaded his trunk and found a compartment and sat down. He looked out the window at the platform, and through the window at the world beyond. A red-haired boy knocked on the compartment door and asked if the space was free. Harry said it was. The boy came in and sat down with the slightly awkward confidence of someone who was not shy, but who was out of his usual context, and introduced himself as Ron Weasley, and Harry introduced himself, and the recognition on Ron's face at the name was something Harry would need to learn to manage, because it was not going to stop happening. They talked. Harry found this easier than he had expected, not because he was naturally easy in conversation, he was not, but because Ron Weasley talked with the comfortable ease of someone who had never had reason to be careful about what he said, someone who had grown up in a house full of people who were interested in the same things he was interested in, and this was so different from Harry's experience of conversation, that it was almost restful. The girl came to the compartment looking for a toad. She was very precise in her speech and very confident in her presence, and she knew a great deal about Hogwarts already, which she conveyed in a manner that was intended to be informative, and landed slightly to the left of that intention. Her name was Hermione Granger. Harry noticed that she was carrying, alongside the standard textbooks, 2 additional volumes that were not on the supply list. He recognized one of them. It was a survey of medieval wandless magic traditions that he had bought in Flourish and Blotts. She caught his glance and explained that she always tried to read ahead of the curriculum. He said that he did too. Their eyes met for a moment with the particular recognition of 2 people who have organized their survival around the same strategies. The toad was not in the compartment. She went on to the next one. The train moved. England unrolled outside the window, London becoming suburbs becoming countryside, and Harry sat with the countryside going past, and felt the magical world assembling itself around him with each passing mile, the pressure building slowly as they moved further from the Muggle south, and deeper into a geography that was, for the first time in his life, his. He thought about the stone floor and the carved lines. He thought about the prior tradition and the watermark name and the restricted section on level 4. He thought about Professor McGonagall's careful look and Ollivander's careful silence. He was going somewhere, finally. He was going somewhere that had been waiting for him, in the way that certain places waited for certain people, in the way that the dream had been waiting for him every night, patient and permanent, the forest and the stone and the green smell of something ancient. He put his hand against the window. The glass was cool. The countryside ran past beyond it, green and dark in the early September rain. He felt, very faintly, the pulse. It was stronger here. Stronger with every mile. As though whatever was in him, whatever had been pulsing in walls and warming beneath his hands, was waking up as it moved closer to something it recognized. He kept his face neutral and watched the countryside. Ron was eating something from a paper bag and offering to share and explaining the various magical sweets available on the trolley. Harry accepted a chocolate frog and listened and kept one part of his attention on the thing he could feel building in his chest, quiet and deep, like a note that had been sounding for a very long time in a register no one else could hear. He was nearly there. He was nearly somewhere he could begin to understand what he was. He was 11 years old and patient and full of questions that he had not yet had the context to ask, and the train carried him north through the rain toward a castle that was older than almost anything in Britain, and under the castle, the earth was very old and very deep, and in the deep earth something enormous and patient and magical stirred faintly, the way something stirred in him, with the recognition that was not memory and not instinct, but something between the two. They arrived after dark. They crossed the lake into boats, and Harry saw the castle for the first time, lit against the black sky above the water, its towers and buttresses and countless lit windows reflected in the black surface of the lake below, doubled and perfect. He has seen pictures of castles. He has seen them in textbooks and history books and on tourist signs. He had not understood, from pictures, the quality of age that a real castle had, the way it imposed itself on the landscape not through dominance but through permanence, the way it said, I have been here before everything else you can see, and I will be here after. He sat in the boat and looked at the castle, and felt the pulse in his chest become something almost too large to hold still, a pressure that wanted to expand, and he gripped the side of the boat, and breathed steadily and held it, the way he had held everything all his life, with the careful interior discipline of someone who had learned that showing was dangerous. The boats touched the bank. The first years climbed out. Professor McGonagall met them on the steps and spoke to them with brisk precision about what was to come. Harry stood in the crowd of first years and looked up at the castle entrance above him, and felt, for the first time in his life, the absolute certainty that he was in the right place. Not comfortable, not safe, not understood, but right. The way key was right when it entered the correct lock, before it turned, before anything opened, just a moment of perfect fit. He was here. He was home, if home meant the place where the deepest part of you finally recognized its context. He followed the others inside. He walked through the stone entrance hall of Hogwarts Castle, which was 1,000 years old and built on ground that was older still, and beneath his feet, through the stone floor and the deep bedrock below it, he felt a pulse answer him, strong and unmistakable. A heartbeat in the earth, steady and ancient and vast. He kept his face neutral. He walked forward. He was ready to begin. The sorting took place in the great hall, beneath a ceiling that was not a ceiling, but an opening into the night sky, or the image of one cloud and star rendered in enchanted space above the 4 long tables of the 4 houses. Harry stood with the other first years in the line before the stool and the ragged hat, and waited for his turn with the patience he had applied to everything in his life that required waiting, which was most things. He watched the hat sort his new classmates, watched the hat's mouth open and deliver its verdict, watched each student go to their table, and be absorbed into their house, with the ease or difficulty that personality and circumstance provided. Hermione Granger went to Gryffindor with a speed that suggested the hat had not needed long. Ron Weasley went to Gryffindor with the ease of someone taking his expected seat at a table he had always known was his. A pale pointed-faced boy named Draco Malfoy went to Slytherin with a certainty that suggested the hat had been waiting for that particular placement, the way a lock waits for its key. Harry Potter. He sat on the stool. He put on the hat. The darkness of the hat's interior closed around him, and he sat in it and waited. The hat spoke in his head. Not in his ears, not in the air around him, but directly in his head, in a voice that was old in a way he had not yet encountered, a voice that had spent 1,000 years learning the interior landscapes of people, and had developed a complete and unsentimental understanding of what it found there. It said, in a tone of moderate surprise, that Harry Potter was more complex than expected. Harry said nothing. He waited. The hat moved through him with the thoroughness of a good reader moving through a complicated text, not reading the surface, but following the structure, the grammar of him, what he was made of and in what proportions. It noted courage. It noted intelligence, a specific quality of intelligence, systematic and patient and hungry. It noted loyalty, the loyalty of someone who had not had enough people to be loyal to, and who would be, given the right context, formidably devoted. It noted ambition, and it paused there, noting the particular flavor of Harry's ambition, which was not the ambition of power or status, but the ambition of understanding, the deep ravenous need to know. And then it found the other thing. It went very quiet inside the hat. A different kind of quiet from the shop in Diagon Alley, this one more complex, more uncertain, the quiet of something encountering something else that it did not entirely know what to do with. It said, in a quieter register, that this was unexpected. Harry said, again in the interior space of the hat, that he supposed it must be. The hat said that there was a question of placement that was more complex than usual, and that Harry himself might have some insight into where he would best develop. Harry thought about the books at the bottom of his trunk, the 3 private books he had chosen himself. He thought about the restricted section on level 4 and the line on his supply list. He thought about development and what it required. He said, as clearly as he could manage inside his own head, that he wanted to be somewhere with access to the library. The hat made a sound that was, possibly, a laugh. All the houses had access to the library, it said. Harry said yes, but he suspected some houses had better pretexts for spending time there than others. The hat considered this. Then it said, with a finality that felt like a decision that had been waiting to be made, that the answer was Gryffindor. It said it not with the simple authority of most of its pronouncements, but with something slightly more complex, a note of particular attention, the way a teacher singled out a student not for performance, but for potential. It said, very quietly, just before it was removed from his head, that Harry should be careful. Not with magic, with himself. Then it shouted Gryffindor to the hall. Harry walked to the Gryffindor table to the sound of applause and settled in beside Ron Weasley and across from Hermione Granger, and looked up at the enchanted sky overhead, and thought about what the hat had meant by careful. He thought he understood. He thought it had meant the same thing Professor McGonagall's look had meant, and Ollivander's silence had meant. It meant that there were people watching. It meant that what he carried was visible, to those who knew what to look for. He would need to be very careful indeed. Not in the way the hat meant, perhaps, but careful in his own way, the way he had always been careful, the way of someone who had learned that the world was full of things that wanted to use what you were, and that the first skill of survival was knowing when to show it, and when to hold it still. He held it still. He ate the feasts that appeared on the table around him, and listened to the conversations and watched the hall, learning its geography and its populations the way he learned every new environment, with patient systematic attention. And beneath the stone floor of the great hall, very far below, in the deep bedrock of the hill on which the castle stood, the pulse beat on, steady and patient and vast. It had been waiting a very long time. It could wait a little longer. The dormitory smelled like candle wax and old wood and something else, something underneath those ordinary smells that Harry could not immediately name, but that he associated, already, with the particular quality of Hogwarts itself. It was not quite the smell of the dream. The dream smelled of rain and iron and deep earth. This was closer to parchment and worn stone, and the specific dryness of air that has circulated inside the same enclosed space for a very long time. The smell of a place that had been inhabited continuously, that had absorbed the presence of everyone who had passed through it the way stone absorbed heat, slowly and thoroughly. He lay in his four-poster bed in the first-year boys' dormitory of Gryffindor Tower, and listened to the sounds of the other boys settling into sleep, and he did not sleep himself. He was not anxious. He had spent enough of his childhood lying awake in his cupboard. That sleeplessness was not an experience he associated with anxiety so much as with useful quiet, the particular quality of nighttime silence, in which it was possible to think without interruption. He lay with his hands folded on his chest and stared at the canopy above him and thought. He thought about the pulse. He had felt it throughout the evening, through the feast and the sorting and the walk through the castle to the tower. Felt it the way you felt a bass note in music, not quite hearing it, but aware of it in your chest, in your bones. It had changed as he moved through the castle. It was stronger in some corridors than others, stronger near the ground floors than the upper ones, much stronger when they passed a particular stretch of corridor on the third floor that had no obvious distinguishing features, but that made the pulse spike briefly into something almost sharp, almost visible, before it subsided again. He thought about what the book had said. The deep structure of the world. The underlying rules by which reality organized itself. He thought about the word rules and what it meant when you applied it to something as large as reality. Rules implied structure. Structure implied that the structure could be perceived, could be mapped. The book had said that practitioners of the prior tradition had learned to perceive the deep structure, had learned to hold it in their awareness. He thought about holding it in his awareness, and wondered if that was what he was doing when he felt the pulse. Whether the thing he had been doing his whole life, the half-noticing of warmth and pressure and the particular texture of the air in different places, was a form of perceiving the deep structure without knowing it. Whether he had been doing it all along without understanding what it was. He thought about the restricted section on level 4. He thought about the watermark name in the old book. He thought about being careful. Around him, Ron Weasley was already asleep, breathing with the deep unconscious ease of someone for whom sleep was simply a room he entered, rather than a state he negotiated. Two of the boys, Neville Longbottom, who had been sorted into Gryffindor with a surprise on his face that suggested the hat had startled him considerably, and Seamus Finnegan, who had told everyone within earshot that his mother was a witch and his father was a muggle, and seemed to feel this was an important thing to establish, were also asleep or near it. Dean Thomas, the fifth boy in the dormitory, was still awake. Harry could hear the quality of his breathing, too controlled for sleep, and the occasional small sound of him shifting in his bed. He was probably doing what Harry was doing, lying in the dark thinking about everything that had happened. That seemed reasonable. A great deal had happened. Harry turned his head and looked at the window. The castle windows in the tower had a different quality from the windows of Privet Drive, not because of their stone frames or their slight irregularity of old glass, but because of what was outside them. Outside the windows of Privet Drive was a street, an arrangement of human intention and maintenance, everything in it placed there by someone with a purpose. Outside the windows of Gryffindor Tower was sky, the actual sky, unmediated, the same sky that had been above this hill for all of the castle's 1,000 years, and before it, and looking at it through old glass, Harry felt a vertigo that was not unpleasant, the vertigo of scale, of seeing something that was simply larger than your usual frame of reference. He got up very quietly. He put on his glasses and his school robes over his pajamas, and took his wand from the bedside table. He had not yet done anything with the wand, had not tested it beyond the moment in Ollivanders when it had chosen him, and carrying it felt strange still, like carrying an extension of himself that he had not yet learned to use. He tucked it in his robe pocket and went to the window. The ground spread below him in the dark, the lake a flat black mirror, the forest at the edges of everything, and the sky above very clear and very full of stars. He stood at the window and looked out at it and felt the pulse, steady and deep, and he put his hand against the stone of the windowsill, and the stone was warm. Not the warmth of a sun-heated surface that had not yet cooled. Warmer than that, and different in quality, that same organic warmth he had felt in the wall at Privet Drive, and in the bedrock of the vault at Gringotts. The warmth of something that was alive in the way that stone was not alive, or in the way that stone was alive if you understood alive to mean active, engaged, participating in something. He pressed his palm flat against the stone and held it there. The warmth moved. Not dramatically, not with the sudden alarming shift of a thing that was changing, but with the slow deliberate movement of a tide, a movement that was timed to something much longer than his own pulse, a rhythm that his pulse was too fast and too small to keep time with, but that he could feel as a reference point, the deep beat of the castle's particular life, the thing that 1,000 years of concentrated magic had done to the stone and earth of this place. He stood at the window with his hand on the warm stone for a long time. Long enough that his legs ached. He was not doing anything. He was learning to do nothing, which was different. He was learning to be still enough that the thing he could feel in the stone could be felt more clearly, the way you held very still to listen to something at the edge of hearing. He was doing this instinctively. He had not read in any of his books that this was the correct approach to perceiving the deep structure. The books had not contained instructions. He was doing it because it was what the thing he could feel seemed to require, the way a scent required you to be still and breathe slowly to catch its full quality. At some point the pulse in the stone and the pulse in his own chest aligned. Just for a moment, just a single beat, they synchronized. And in that moment of synchronization something passed between them that was not information exactly and not feeling exactly, but something that contained elements of both, a vast and patient communication that he could not decode, but that registered as meaning in the same way that music registered as meaning, below the threshold of language. In the part of awareness that preceded words. He pulled his hand away. He stood for a moment with his palm tingling slightly, the warmth fading from his skin. His heart was beating faster. He was breathing carefully through his nose. He went back to bed. He lay down and pulled the covers up and stared at the canopy and thought. In the precise, methodical way he thought about everything that required thinking, about what had just happened. He thought about it for a long time. He came to no conclusions that could be stated clearly. What he arrived at instead was a question, a single question that was more useful than a conclusion, because it had more places to go. The question was, if the castle itself contained, in its stone and its deep roots in the earth, some form of the thing that the book called the deep structure, what had put it there? Not time. Time could do many things to stone. He did not think time alone could put a pulse in it. Something had happened here. Something had been built into this place at the foundation, literally at the foundation, in the earth and stone on which the castle stood. Something that had been here long before the castle, in the hill itself, and that the castle had been built around or built on top of, deliberately, by people who knew it was there. He thought about what it would have meant to know it was there. He thought about the prior tradition, and the figure at the center of the anonymous book's account, the figure whose name had been removed from the text. His watermark absence was itself a form of presence, the shape of something enormous visible in the space where it should have been. He fell asleep with this thought still unresolved, which was the right way to leave an unresolved thought, holding it open, letting it continue to work in the background. In sleep the dream came, more vivid than usual, the stone floor and the carved lines, and this time when he walked toward the light that was not light, he could hear something he had not heard before. Not the sound of pages turning. A voice. Very distant, too far to make out words, but a voice, speaking with the particular cadence of someone explaining something important, calmly and without urgency, to someone who was ready to hear it. He woke at 6 in the morning before anyone else, and lay in the grey pre-dawn light, and thought that he was, possibly, ready to hear it. He was just not yet sure what it was. The first week of classes at Hogwarts proceeded with the organized momentum of an institution that had been doing this for 1,000 years, and had developed efficient systems for it, systems that looked casual from the outside, but that Harry could see, if he paid attention, were underpinned by a careful and deliberate structure. He paid attention. He had always paid attention. It was a survival skill long before it was a learning skill. Transfiguration was taught by Professor McGonagall, who conducted her class with the brisk systematic rigor of someone who had been teaching the same foundations for many years, and had refined her methods to their most essential form. She turned her desk into a pig and back again to open the lesson. She explained the theory of transfiguration in terms that were clear and precise, and that raised, for Harry, several immediate questions about the underlying mechanism by which intention in one movement caused matter to change its essential nature. He did not ask these questions in class. He had learned, in his Muggle school, that asking certain kinds of questions in class produced results that were uncomfortable. Attention from teachers who either wanted to use your intelligence to make other students feel inadequate, or resentment from students who had not thought of the question first, or both. He had learned to keep his keener questions for the library and his more ordinary questions for the classroom. He wrote the questions in a small notebook he kept in his inner robe pocket. He had a system for the notebook. Immediate questions on the left page. Deeper structural questions on the right page. The notebook's right pages were filling up faster than the left. Professor Flitwick taught charms with a visible and genuine enthusiasm that Harry found unexpectedly encouraging. Not because Harry needed encouragement, exactly, but because there was something useful about being in the presence of someone who found their subject genuinely interesting, rather than merely mandatory. It was instructive in its own way, a demonstration of what sustained engagement with a discipline looked like in someone who had practiced it for many years. The Wingardium Leviosa lesson in the third week, which Harry's notebook noted as the first practical spellwork of the curriculum, produced an incident. It was a small incident. It would not have been visible to most of the class. Harry almost certainly made sure of that, though afterward he was not entirely sure whether his making sure had been conscious or instinctive. The class was practicing the levitation charm on their feathers. Harry had read the textbook chapter on it twice and understood the theory, the specific wand motion creating a shaped intent that interacted with the charm's verbal component to produce a defined and controlled effect. He executed the motion and set the incantation and the feather rose. That was ordinary. What was not ordinary was what happened in the half-second between the completion of the incantation and the feather's motion. What happened was that the air in the immediate vicinity of the feather changed. Not visibly. not in any way that would register on a photograph or a measurement, but the quality of it changed, in the way that the quality of the stone had changed under his hand at the window. The deep structure, if that was what it was, engaged with the spell in a way that the spell's design had not accounted for, and the result was that the feather did not merely rise, it rose, and also, for a fraction of a second, was somewhere slightly different from where it had been, and where it now was, as though it had taken a path to its current position, that did not pass through the intervening space. The fraction of a second was too small to see. Harry felt it. He felt it in the wand and in the hand holding the wand and in the chest and somewhere behind his eyes. A brief resonance, the sensation of something having engaged that was larger than the task required. He lowered the feather carefully. He set his wand on the desk and looked at the feather sitting on the desk in front of him, and thought about what had just happened. He thought about it for 3 seconds, which was all the time he had before Professor Flitwick bounced past his desk praising his excellent work, and Harry smiled and said thank you, and filed the 3 seconds of thought away under deeper structural questions in the right page of his notebook. Later he would understand that this was the first clear evidence of what the pulse was doing when he performed magic. That the deep structure, or whatever was in him that connected to the deep structure, did not simply exist alongside his normal magical ability. It interfaced with it, engaged with it, used the structured spell as a point of contact to do something additional, something that the spell's structure had not been designed to do. Like using a formally marked pathway to reach a destination that was off the path's intended route. He wrote this in the notebook that evening in the common room, in the coded shorthand he had been developing over the preceding days, a system of notation that would look, to anyone glancing over his shoulder, like unusually detailed study notes. He wrote it sitting in an armchair by the fire, while Ron played wizard chess against himself, and Hermione read ahead in the charms textbook. He had been watching Hermione with the same systematic attention he applied to everything else in his new environment, and he had reached several conclusions. She was the most thorough reader he had yet encountered, including himself, which he found both admirable and interesting. She was also operating under a specific pressure that Harry recognized because he had lived inside a version of it his whole life, the pressure of needing to be correct, of needing to demonstrate competence, because the alternative to competence was a kind of vulnerability that she clearly found intolerable. In her case, it was the pressure of a Muggle-born witch at a school where blood heritage was a social currency, where being demonstrably excellent was the only reliable counter to being considered inherently less than. He understood this. He thought she was managing it about as well as it could be managed. He also thought she was going to ask him, eventually, what he was writing so carefully in that notebook. He would need to have an answer ready that was true enough to satisfy her, and incomplete enough to protect what he was actually doing. He looked back at his notes and thought about the charms lesson and the fraction of a second, and about what it meant that the magic in him was doing something additional, something beyond the spell's design. He thought about what the anonymous book had said about practitioners of the prior tradition, adjusting the rules by which reality organized itself. He thought about the feather taking a path that did not pass through the intervening space. He thought, that was not a levitation charm. That was something else using the levitation charm as a vehicle. He wrote this in the right page shorthand. He looked at it for a moment. He wrote underneath it, learn to drive before learning what the engine is doing. He was not going to pursue this further, not yet. He was going to learn the standard curriculum thoroughly and correctly. He was going to master the spells as designed, understand the theory as taught, build the foundation that every magical practitioner in this world was built on. The prior tradition, whatever it was, would have to wait until he had the context to approach it safely. He was 11. He was patient. He would wait. Except that the prior tradition, as it turned out, had no interest in waiting for him. It happened for the second time in Potions, which was taught in the dungeons by Professor Severus Snape, who had a talent for the theatrical negative that Harry found professionally interesting in the way that one professional found interest in another's technique, even a technique you found unpleasant. Snape had singled Harry out in the first lesson with the rehearsed contempt of someone who had been preparing the performance for some time, asking questions designed to demonstrate ignorance, responding to Harry's correct answers, because Harry had read ahead in the textbook and could answer correctly, with the particular contempt reserved for people who were correctly answering the wrong questions, the contempt of someone who wanted to show that knowing the answer was itself a form of failure. Harry had filed this away under people who want to use what you are and moved on. In the 4th week of Potions, they were brewing a simple boil cure potion, following instructions that were methodical and specific, each step designed to build on the last, the potion's chemistry, or magical chemistry, which operated under related but distinct principles, developing in a particular sequence toward a predictable result. Harry followed the instructions. He was a good potion maker, he had discovered, for the same reasons he was good at other forms of sustained careful work, patience and attention, and the willingness to do each step correctly, rather than rushing to the end. His potion was developing well, the correct color, the correct consistency, the correct smell. And then the incident happened. It was not his fault. He would think about this later and confirm it. He had not done anything. He had been adding the porcupine quills at the correct moment, following the instruction precisely, and the addition was working as the textbook described, the potion fizzing briefly before settling. But the thing that lived in the deep structure of him, the thing that had engaged with the Wingardium Leviosa, chose this moment to engage with the potion. He felt it happen before it was visible, the same resonance he had felt in charms but stronger here, as though the deep dungeons of the castle were closer to whatever the pulse was rooted in. The resonance moved through him from his chest downward, through his hands and into the cauldron, and the potion's surface changed. Not catastrophically. Not explosively. It did not melt anyone or turn anyone a surprising color. What it did was subtler and in some ways more alarming. The potion's surface became briefly translucent, not merely clear but translucent in a different way, in a way that suggested the liquid was occupying the cauldron, and simultaneously somewhere else, and in the moment of its translucency, Harry could see something in it, or through it. Something that was not his own distorted reflection in the liquid but a different image, an impression, the carved stone floor of the dream, the half letters and half pictures, vivid and precise for a single second before the potion snapped back to its ordinary self. Harry took a slow breath. He looked down at his cauldron. The potion looked perfectly ordinary. Correct color, correct consistency, correct smell. He looked up. Snape was on the other side of the dungeon, watching Neville Longbottom's potion with the expression of a man who found the specific failure of others a form of entertainment that he had not yet decided to conceal. He had not seen. Harry looked around carefully. No one in his immediate vicinity had noticed. They were too busy with their own cauldrons. Seamus was having trouble with his porcupine quill timing. Ron was asking Hermione a question in the undertone of someone who wants information, but does not want to be seen wanting it. Harry looked back at his cauldron and thought, in the 3 seconds he allowed himself before he had to continue the potion. That was not a malfunction. That was the deep structure interfacing with the potion the same way it interfaced with the charm. And the image it showed him, the image in the translucent liquid, was the floor from the dream. He added the next ingredient on time and in the correct quantity. He finished the potion correctly. He turned it in at the end of class, and received a non-committal response from Snape, which in Snape's grading economy, meant that the potion was correct. He walked back up from the dungeons with Ron and Hermione, and said very little, thinking very carefully. He was thinking about what the image meant. Not how it had appeared. He was beginning to develop a working theory of the how, but why that image, why the stone floor with its carved marks. He had been seeing it in the dream for years. It was clearly significant. The question was whether it was significant because of what it literally was, a real place, a real floor, somewhere that existed or had existed, or whether it was significant in a more symbolic way, an image that his mind had generated to represent something about the nature of what he was. He thought it was probably both. He thought the carved marks on the floor were probably real marks in a real place, and that the place was probably something he needed to find. He thought the image was showing him something. He thought he needed the restricted section. The library at Hogwarts was everything Harry had hoped it would be, and several things he had not thought to hope for. It was large, extending over 2 full floors of the castle's central section with a mezzanine level and alcoves in the deep window embrasures that were perfect for solitary reading in bad weather. It smelled the way a library should smell, of paper and dust, and the quiet authority of accumulated knowledge. It had high windows that let in grey Scottish light on grey Scottish days, and made the reading lamps necessary and warm, and it had Madame Pince, the librarian, who was protective of the books with the intensity of someone who had decided that books were more important than the people who wanted to read them, which Harry found understandable if interpersonally challenging. He spent most of his free time in the library. This was not unusual among the more academically oriented Gryffindors, and Hermione's regular presence there gave him a social cover that he found useful. The library was simply where the serious students went. He could be there without it signifying anything more particular than conscientiousness. He was using this time to pursue 2 parallel lines of research. The first was the standard curriculum. He was reading ahead in all his subjects, not to show off in class, but because understanding the context of each lesson before it happened made the lesson more useful, made the specific practical instruction rest on a foundation of theoretical comprehension. That meant he could engage with it at a deeper level. He was building competency as quickly as he honestly could. The second line of research was less straightforward. He was looking for anything that might relate to what the anonymous book had called the prior tradition. Anything in the magical historical literature about forms of magic that predated the wand, about the deep structure of reality, about the figures who were associated with the foundations of the magical world in Britain. He was doing this carefully, using reference texts that directed him to other reference texts, following the bibliographic architecture of the library toward older and less read material. He found very little, and the shape of what he found was interesting. The absence of information about the prior tradition was not the absence of ignorance. It was not that the information had never been recorded, or that no one had thought to record it. The pattern of the absences, the bibliographic trails that stopped abruptly, the reference texts that cited sources which were listed in the catalog but could not be found on the shelves, the index entries that led to pages that seemed to have been removed from the bound volumes with professional care, suggested that the information had been present and had been deliberately reduced. Someone, or several someones, had gone through the library's records of the prior tradition and edited them. Harry sat in his usual alcove with this conclusion and looked at it steadily. He was not surprised. He had suspected something like this from the moment he had found the watermark name in his anonymous book. The deliberateness of the watermark, the care with which it had been done at a level below the paper's surface, that was not the work of a brief or casual decision. It was the work of an institution that had decided, with considered purpose, that this information should not be accessible. The question was why. He wrote this in the right-hand page of his notebook. He wrote underneath it, "What you hide says as much as what you keep. Sometimes more." He was still thinking about this when Hermione sat down across from him with a large stack of books, and began arranging them in the precise categorical order she used to organize a serious study session. She looked at his notebook. Not the contents, just the existence of it, the small leather-covered volume he had been writing in steadily for 3 weeks. She said that she had noticed he took detailed notes outside of class. He said that he found it useful to write things down when he was working through a problem. She said, "What sort of problem?" He looked at her across the table. She was watching him with that assessor's look, the one she used to gauge whether the information she was about to receive would satisfy the actual question she was asking, which was usually a more interesting question than the one she had spoken aloud. He said that he had been trying to understand the historical context of the spells in the curriculum, that he had been finding some gaps in the historical record that he was trying to account for. She said, immediately, that she had noticed that too. She said that the History of Magic textbook, Professor Bin's Muggle-written curriculum companion, covered the period before the founding of Hogwarts very cursorily, almost dismissively, in a way that seemed at odds with the importance of that period to understanding everything that came after it. Harry looked at her. He looked at her carefully. He said that she was right, and that the dismissiveness seemed possibly deliberate, rather than simply incurious. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the train, when she recognized the wandless magic book, with the particular register of recognition that meant an intellectual connection had been made. She said, very precisely, that she had found 3 books in the lower stacks that seemed relevant, but that some of their reference citations pointed to texts that were not available on open shelves. He said that he had found the same thing. They looked at each other across the table with the reference books and the small leather notebook between them. Harry made a decision. He made it in the 3 seconds he had trained himself to use for decisions of this kind, calculating the probabilities. She was thorough and she was careful, and she was going to find things on her own that might lead to the same conclusions he was drawing, at which point she would ask him what he knew, and he would be in the position of having withheld information from someone who was effectively an ally. The mathematics of it favored disclosure, not full disclosure, but enough. He told her that the restriction pattern of the unavailable texts suggested deliberate editing rather than simple imitation. He told her that he had found the same absent citations in multiple independent reference chains, which meant it was systematic. He told her that he believed there was a body of historical information about pre-founding magical practice that had been deliberately made inaccessible. She absorbed this. She did not express surprise or skepticism. She had that quality of mind that accepted new information on its merits, and worked out what it implied before deciding how to feel about it. She said, "Deliberately made inaccessible by whom?" He said he did not yet know, but that the construction of the library catalog suggested the editing had happened a long time ago, centuries possibly, given the age of some of the reference formats being used. She said, "So someone several centuries ago decided that information about pre-founding magic should not be in the accessible library." He said yes. She looked at the wall of bookshelves beyond the reference section for a moment. She looked back at him. She said that there was presumably a restricted section. He said yes. She said that access to the restricted section required written permission from a teacher. He said that he was aware of this. She looked at him for one more second. Then she opened her first book and did not ask the question she was clearly also asking, the question about whether he had access, whether the supply list line he had never mentioned to anyone had said something about the restricted section, whether there was something specific about Harry Potter and the pre-founding magical tradition that he was not telling her. She did not ask because she was, fundamentally, a person who respected other people's processes of figuring things out, even when those processes were slower than the one she would have preferred. She filed the questions and waited. Harry appreciated this. He made a note of it in the appropriate column of his internal accounting. The incident with the first floor corridor happened in the 6th week of term. It was not something he caused. He needed to be clear about this in his own thinking, clear in the same way he had been clear about the potions incident. He had not done anything, had not intended anything, had not made any decision about what happened. He had simply been present, and the deep structure had responded to something in the environment that he could not have predicted. He was walking back from the library after an evening study session, taking the longer route because the direct route to Gryffindor Tower involved a staircase that had recently developed the habit of moving at unpredictable times, in ways that were inconvenient after 9 o'clock. He was walking along the first floor corridor on the east side of the castle, thinking about the bibliographic absence pattern he had been mapping, when he passed the 3rd floor corridor junction. He stopped. He had been aware of this corridor since the first night, the spot where the pulse had spiked as they walked past. He was aware of it in the way you were aware of something in your peripheral vision, not focusing on it, but tracking it. He stopped at the junction because the pulse was doing something different tonight, not spiking but building, a slow sustained increase, the way pressure built before weather changed. He stood at the junction and breathed and held himself still in the way he had learned at the window on his first night, the way that let him feel the deep structure more clearly. He felt it. He felt the thing in the third-floor corridor. He could not describe it in terms that would have meant anything to someone who had not felt the pulse, but if he had tried, he would have said it felt like a question being asked by something very large in a language he did not yet speak. It felt like the stone floor of the dream, the half letters and half pictures that were almost readable, translated into air and space and architectural weight. He stood at the junction for 30 seconds. Then he moved away from it deliberately, walked back toward the tower without hurrying, because hurrying would suggest awareness, and he had learned long ago that appearing to know something was sometimes more dangerous than knowing it. He went back to the dormitory and sat on his bed and thought about the third-floor corridor. He thought about the fact that the pulse there was specifically related to whatever was in that corridor, that the corridor was significant to the deep structure in the same way the castle's bedrock was significant, but differently, more specifically, the way a specific word was significant compared to the general presence of language. He thought about the fact that Professor Dumbledore had very publicly announced in the opening feast that the third-floor corridor on the right-hand side was forbidden to all students, and that entering it would mean a painful death. He thought about the word death and what it meant that the headmaster used it, not danger or detention but death, and about what it implied that something requiring that level of deterrent was being kept in his school. He did not intend to go to the third-floor corridor. He was not curious about whatever Dumbledore was keeping there in the ordinary sense of that curiosity, the adventurous student curiosity that he could see operating in Ron Weasley, who had raised the subject twice, with the enthusiasm of someone who found dangerous things inherently appealing. Harry's curiosity was different. It was not about the thing in the corridor, but about why the pulse in the corridor had the specific quality it did, why the deep structure was responding to that location. He thought about this until he fell asleep, and in the dream the light that was not light was closer than it had ever been, close enough that he could feel the warmth of it on his face, close enough that he could almost hear, not the words but the shape of the voice, and it was not a frightening voice. It was the voice of someone explaining something with great patience to someone they had been waiting a very long time to explain it to. He woke at 4 in the morning with the certainty, absolute and clear as water, that the thing in the third-floor corridor and the pulse in the bedrock and the dream were all aspects of the same thing. That they were all pointing at the same center, the same source, the same enormous patient fact that was assembling itself around him. He lay in the dark and held his certainty steady and examined it from all sides. He thought, I need the restricted section. He thought, I need to understand what Merlin left behind. The name arrived in his thought fully formed, without warning, without him having read it anywhere or thought it consciously before, and he sat up in bed in the dark dormitory and stared at nothing and felt the pulse spike hard in his chest, once, the way a bell rang once when struck. Merlin. The watermark name in the old book. The absence where the name should have been. The prior tradition and the figure at its center. He had not read the name anywhere. He had not heard it spoken in any context that was relevant to what he was thinking about. He had simply known it, the way he sometimes simply knew things, the way the dream was sometimes simply present, fully formed, without the transitional experience of falling asleep. He sat very still in the dark for a long time. Then he reached under his mattress, where he kept the anonymous old book wrapped in the spare jumper, and he took it out and opened it to the chapter on the prior tradition, and he found the first watermarked impression where the name should have been, and he pressed his finger to it. Warm. Warmer than before. And beneath the warmth, beneath the paper, the impression of letters that were not quite present, that existed at a level below the text surface in the way that the deep structure existed at a level below the visible surface of reality. He could almost feel the shape of them under his fingertip. Almost. He put the book away. He lay back down. The night was very dark and very quiet, and the pulse in the castle's foundations was steady and deep. He thought about patience. About the kind of patience that was not passive but active, the patience of a mind that was working continuously below the threshold of urgency, processing and connecting and building towards something. The patience that was required when the thing you were moving toward was very large and very old, and could not be rushed without being misunderstood. He had a plan. It was not yet a complete plan, it was the outline of one, a framework of intentions into which the specific actions would fit as he found them. The framework had several components. The first was the restricted section, and the arrangement Professor McGonagall had indicated on his supply list. He had not yet gone to her about it. He was waiting until he had enough context for the visit to be productive, enough foundation from his preliminary research to make the best use of whatever access she was prepared to offer. The second was his own direct experience of the deep structure, the pulse and what he could learn from it, and this required time and patience and the discipline of regular attention, the same discipline the anonymous book had described as necessary to perceive the deep structure clearly. The third was the third-floor corridor, which he did not intend to enter, but which he intended to understand better, to understand why the pulse responded to it as it did. And the fourth, which was less a component and more a context, was the question of why. Why now? Why him? Why Merlin's magic, if that was what it was, the prior tradition, had chosen to wake up in an 11-year-old boy who had grown up in a cupboard under the stairs in Surrey. He had read enough magical history in his 6 weeks at Hogwarts to know that magic of this kind, the old deep-rooted kind, did not do things without reasons. The reasons were sometimes inscrutable, sometimes lost, sometimes not recognizable as reasons until much later. But the principle held. The deep structure was not random. It was ordered, patterned, the way mathematics was ordered and patterned beneath the apparent chaos of its applications. He thought, if I am carrying something that has been asleep for centuries, there is a reason it is waking now. He thought, Voldemort. The name was not in the books available to first years. It was in conversations, in the careful way adults avoided it, and students used it as a dare, a word too dangerous to say, too significant to reduce to a nickname, a name that meant something terrible in the recent memory of the magical world. Harry had heard it in the context of his own story, the night his parents died, the night the curse rebounded, the night that everything happened, and then nothing continued, not for Voldemort, not the way it did for most people. He had not thought much about Voldemort in the preceding weeks, not directly, because thinking about Voldemort directly required thinking about his parents' deaths, which required a kind of interior space that he had not yet had room for. He had kept it in the peripheral vision of his thinking, aware of it, tracking it, not focusing. He was focusing now. If the deep structure was waking in him, if whatever Merlin had carried was reasserting itself through his bloodline or his history or whatever mechanism had chosen him, it was doing so at a moment when the most significant dark magical force in a century had been disrupted but not destroyed. Harry knew, from the conversations he had carefully not quite overheard, that there was disagreement about whether Voldemort was truly gone. The adults who used the name had all used it in the past tense, with the specific uncertainty of people who were not entirely confident in that tense. As something old and enormous was waking up in Harry Potter, it was possible that something old and enormous on the other side was already in motion. He lay in the dark of the dormitory and held this thought and felt the pulse in the castle's foundations, steady and patient and vast. He was not afraid. He was something more complex than afraid, something that included awareness of danger and acceptance of it, and a kind of focus that sharpened in proportion to the scale of what he was approaching. He was 11 years old and carrying something ancient that he did not yet understand, in a castle full of secrets and a world full of threats, and a future full of things that were already moving toward him, whether he moved toward them or not. He thought, then I had better be ready. He closed his eyes. He breathed. He let the pulse in the deep stone ground him the way the stone grounded the castle, the way the castle grounded the hill, the way the hill grounded the earth, layer on layer on layer, all the way down to whatever was at the center of things. He slept. And in the dream, for the first time, the voice was close enough to make out a single word. The word was wait. He waited. He was good at waiting. He had been waiting his whole life for the context in which to begin. The context was here now. The castle was around him, and the old magic was in him, and the world was assembling itself into the shape of something that had been a long time coming. He was ready. In the morning, he would go to McGonagall. Professor McGonagall's office was on the first floor of the castle, in a corner that the building seemed to have constructed specifically to contain her, a space that was precise and ordered and utterly without softness, but that was not cold in the way that cold places were cold. It was warm in the way that disciplined things were warm, the warmth of something that worked, that functioned, that had its own interior heat generated by sustained purpose. The bookshelves were arranged with military exactness. The desk was clear except for what was actively needed. The single personal item Harry could see, a small tartan patterned tin on the corner of the desk that presumably contained biscuits, was placed with the same precision as everything else, as though even comfort had to justify its dimensions. Harry knocked at precisely 8 in the morning on a Saturday in the 7th week of term. He had chosen Saturday because it was outside the normal class schedule, which meant the visit would not require explanation to his dormitory companions, and 8 o'clock because it was early enough to suggest seriousness without being early enough to be inconsiderate. She told him to come in. He opened the door and entered and stood in the precise center of the space in front of her desk, not too far from it and not crowding it, the distance that conveyed appropriate respect for both the office and its occupant, without suggesting either uncertainty or aggression. He had spent 2 minutes calibrating this distance in his head before he arrived. She was sitting at her desk with a cup of tea at her right hand, and a set of parchments she was reviewing for what appeared to be a transfiguration essay assignment. She looked up when he entered and set the essays aside with the brisk finality of someone who had been expecting this visit, and was therefore not going to treat it as an interruption. She said, "Mr. Potter, sit down." He sat. He put his hands on his knees and looked at her steadily. There was a moment of assessment, mutual and professional, 2 people taking the measure of what they were actually dealing with, which was more complex than the surface arrangement of teacher and student suggested. She said that she had been wondering when he would come to see her. He said that he had wanted to wait until he had enough foundation to make the conversation useful. She looked at him the way she had looked at him in the kitchen at Privet Drive, the careful look, the look with knowledge behind it that was choosing its visibility. She said, "And do you feel you have that foundation now?" He said that he had a preliminary framework, yes. And that he had questions that the accessible library could not answer, and that his supply list had indicated a specific arrangement that he had not yet taken up, and that he thought it was time to take it up. She was quiet for a moment. She picked up her tea and held it in both hands, not drinking it, but using the warmth of the cup, the way people use physical anchors, when they were thinking about how to approach something carefully. She said, "What do you know, Harry?" It was the first time she had used his given name, and it landed differently from the formal address, more weight to it, a different kind of attention. He told her what he knew. He was precise and systematic about it, laying out what he had observed and experienced in the order he had experienced it, beginning with the pulse he had felt since childhood, and proceeding through the incidents at Ollivanders and the charms lesson and the potions incident, and the third-floor corridor and the window on his first night. He told her about the anonymous book and the watermark name. He told her about the pattern of absent citations in the library. He did not tell her everything. He did not tell her about the dream, or about the name that had arrived in his thought at 4 in the morning, in a fully formed certainty that had no preceding reason. He did not tell her about the moment when the pulse in the stone and the pulse in his chest had synchronized. These things were not evidence. They were interior experience, and interior experience was not the right currency for this particular conversation. She listened without interrupting. She was very good at listening, with the kind of attention that received what was said without immediately sorting it into the categories it expected to find, which was the rarest and most useful form of attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. She set her tea down with a small precise click on the desk surface. She said, "You have been very systematic about this." He said that he generally found systematic approaches more efficient. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said that she was going to tell him some things that were not commonly known, and that she expected him to treat them with discretion, not secrecy exactly, but discretion, the understanding that information of this kind required care in its application and its sharing. He said that he understood discretion. She said, "I know you do. That is one of the things that makes this conversation possible." She stood and moved to the bookshelf behind her desk, and withdrew a thin file of parchment, the kind of file that had been opened and closed many times over many years, its edges worn soft. She held it for a moment and then sat back down and placed it on the desk between them without opening. She said that when Harry Potter had been identified as a survivor of the killing curse, an event without precedent in recorded magical history, there had been considerable debate within the magical community about what it signified. Most of the debate centered on the more immediate and politically significant questions: whether Voldemort was truly destroyed, what had happened to his followers, how the magical world should reorganize itself in the aftermath. These were important questions, and they occupied the attention of most of the people who should have been asking other questions. Professor Dumbledore, she said, had asked other questions. She said that Albus Dumbledore had been, for the past 40 years, the foremost living expert on the history of British magical tradition, including the periods of magical history that were not commonly taught or commonly accessible. He had been a student of the gaps in the record, the specific pattern of what had been removed from the official account, and what had been left in and why. He had been, she said carefully, a student of what the old records called the prior tradition. Harry kept his face neutral. He was very good at keeping his face neutral. She said that when Dumbledore examined the circumstances of Harry's survival, the specific mechanism by which the killing curse had rebounded, he had formed a hypothesis. She said hypothesis with the precision of someone who wanted to be clear that a hypothesis was not a certainty, that it was a structured and well-evidenced hypothesis, but that it remained, technically, unconfirmed. The hypothesis was that the magic which had protected Harry that night, the magic which had allowed a 1-year-old child to survive a curse that had never failed before, was not the magic of the standard wizarding tradition. It was older. It was the kind of magic that the books no longer discussed in full because the books had been edited, over several centuries, by people who had decided that the prior tradition was too dangerous, too unpredictable, and too uncontrollable to be part of the standard curriculum or the standard record. Dumbledore believed, she said, looking at Harry with her careful look, that Harry Potter was not merely a survivor of Voldemort's attack. He believed that Harry was a carrier of the prior tradition, a living inheritor of a form of magic that had not been practiced in any meaningful way since the early medieval period, since the time when the foundations of the magical world as they currently knew it were being laid. Harry said, very quietly, since the time of Merlin. McGonagall went still. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise, because surprise implied she had not been expecting this conversation to be as developed as it was, and she had been expecting exactly this. She said, yes, since the time of Merlin. She opened the thin file. She turned it toward him. The pages inside were old. Not as old as his anonymous book, but old enough that the parchment had gone the particular amber of aged paper, and the ink had browned at the edges where the quill had pressed deepest. The handwriting was not modern. It was the precise and slightly formal cursive of someone from several generations back, but it was readable, and what it said was readable, and Harry read it with the sustained focused attention he gave to everything that mattered. The file contained 12 pages. There were notes, research notes, in the format of someone who was thinking through a problem in writing, using the page to organize an argument. The handwriting was Dumbledore's. He could tell from the style, even without a name on the pages. The notes concerned what Dumbledore called the Merlin line, the question of whether the prior tradition could be inherited biologically or whether it was always re-emergent, a matter of direct magical lineage versus what the notes called resonant inheritance, a form of passing on that operated not through blood, but through what Dumbledore described as the deep structure itself, the tradition selecting its own carriers according to criteria that were not fully understood. Dumbledore's conclusion, reached on the 12th page after 11 pages of careful evidence and argument, was that the Merlin line was not strictly biological, but was also not strictly random. It selected for specific qualities, specific capacities, a particular relationship with the world's underlying magical architecture. He had underlined the phrase in the text, the capacity to perceive and hold the deep structure without being dissolved by it. Harry read the underlined phrase. He read it again. He thought about the pulse in the stone and the synchronized heartbeats at the window on his first night, and the feather taking its impossible path through space, and the image of carved stone in the surface of his potion. He thought about not being dissolved by it. He thought about what that implied about the alternative. He looked up from the file. He said, "He thinks I have this capacity." She said, "He is confident that you have it. The question of degree, of what it means in practice and what it can ultimately do, is less settled. This is not something that has been observed in a living person in a very long time." He said, "How long?" She said, with the slight hesitation of someone deciding how precisely to answer, that the last recorded practitioner with a direct and confirmed connection to the prior tradition had lived approximately 900 years ago. That most of what was known about the tradition at that remove was fragmentary and heavily edited and filtered through the perspectives of people who had decided the tradition was to be suppressed rather than preserved. Harry said, "Who decided that?" She looked at him. She said, "The founders of this school, Mr. Potter. Or rather, 3 of the 4. He thought about this. He thought about what the anonymous book had said about the figure who had taught the 4 founders, and had disagreed with their decision to leave the prior tradition behind, who had left before the school opened. He said, "The 4th founder disagreed." She said, "Godric Gryffindor believed the prior tradition should have been preserved. He was overruled. The suppression of the relevant texts was a joint decision by the remaining 3, and it was implemented systematically across the magical libraries of Britain over the following century." Harry sat with this for a moment. He sat with the specific weight of it, the image of 3 people deciding to remove a body of knowledge from the accessible record, and the effort that would have required, the sustained institutional commitment to keeping something buried. He said, "Why did they suppress it?" She said that the short answer was fear. That the prior tradition was not teachable in the way that wand-based magic was teachable. That it could not be standardized or made safe or reliably controlled, and that the people responsible for establishing a stable magical society in Britain had made a practical decision that a form of magic that could not be controlled was more dangerous as a known possibility than as an unknown absent. Harry said, "They thought that if people knew it existed, they would try to access it." She said, "They thought that if people knew it existed, the wrong people would try to access it. And that the wrong people with access to something that could not be controlled would produce outcomes that no amount of institutional magic could contain." He said, "That seems like a decision made out of fear rather than wisdom." She looked at him with the kind of look that contained appreciation for an accurate observation, and also the awareness that accurate observations were not always sufficient responses to the complexities they were observing. She said that he might be right about that. She said that Dumbledore had spent a great deal of time reaching the same conclusion. Harry looked back at the file. He looked at the underlined phrase again. The capacity to perceive and hold the deep structure without being dissolved by it. He said, "What does level 4 mean?" "The note on my supply list." She stood again. She went to the bookshelf, not the one behind her desk, but the one beside the door, and she moved 3 volumes aside with the practiced motion of someone who had done this many times, and behind them, set into the wall with no handle and no visible lock, was a door that was not a door in the ordinary sense, a door that was the same stone as the wall, except that the stone around its edges was very slightly warmer than the rest of the wall. Warm in the specific way that Harry now recognized. She pressed her hand flat against the center of it. There was a pause, the pause of something considering, and then the door opened inward. She said, "Come." He followed her. Behind the door was a staircase. It went down, which was unexpected, given that the office was on the 1st floor, which meant the staircase was going below the ground level of that part of the castle. The staircase was narrow and lit by wall sconces that gave off a light that was not quite firelight, steadier and slightly cooler, and the walls of the staircase were the old stone of the castle's deepest foundations, not the dressed stone of the visible rooms, but the rough-cut original stone of the first construction, fitted together with the massive imprecision of thousand-year-old building, gaps filled with mortar, that had long since hardened to the same gray as the stone around it. The pulse here was extraordinary. The moment Harry stepped onto the staircase, the pulse rose through the soles of his feet and up through his legs and into his chest with a force that was almost physical, almost something he had to brace against. He put his hand on the wall beside him, and the stone was warm and alive in the way he had felt at the window, but magnified, close, as though the source of the pulse was directly below him, and the staircase was simply closing the distance. He controlled his reaction. He breathed and held himself steady and followed McGonagall down. There were 4 flights. He counted them. The designation level 4 made sense now as a downward designation rather than an upward one. 4 levels below the office, 4 levels below the first floor of the castle, which put them somewhere in the deep bedrock of the hill, the same bedrock he had felt from his window on the first night. The staircase ended in a corridor. The corridor was short, barely 10 feet, and it ended in a room. The room was circular. It was not large, perhaps 30 feet across, and it was lit by the same steady non-firelight as the staircase, though here the light seemed to come from the walls themselves, from something in the stone, rather than from separate fixtures. The ceiling was domed, and in the dome there were carvings, and Harry looked at them and felt the pulse in his chest spike into something that was almost a sound. The carvings were the same as the floor of the dream. The same half letters and half pictures, the same intermediate form that was not quite either but contained both. The same lines running in the same patterns, complex and organized, a grammar of something that was not language, but that functioned like language, that carried meaning in the arrangement of its marks, the way sentences carried meaning in the arrangement of their words. He stood in the center of the circular room and looked up at the domed ceiling with its carved marks, and felt the pulse, enormous and close, surrounding him from all sides, coming up through the stone floor, and through the curved walls, and from the dome overhead. And the pulse was not in the castle now. The pulse was in this room, and this room was the source of it, the center of the thing he had been feeling since he arrived. He was standing at the heart of it. He lowered his gaze from the dome. He looked at the room. There were no shelves in the ordinary sense. There were niches cut into the circular wall, 12 of them, evenly spaced, and in each niche there was a stone surface, a shallow table carved from the same rock as the wall, and on these surfaces there were objects, not books, not the parchment records and leather-bound volumes of the library above, something older. Tablets, some stone, some what appeared to be fired clay, some material he could not immediately identify, dark and slightly lustrous, the color of deep water. The tablets were covered in the same script as the dome, the half-letter half-picture marks, and they were clearly old in a way that old things were old when they had survived long enough that age was not a quality they wore, but something they had become. McGonagall stood beside him in the room and let him look. She was very quiet, the way people were quiet in spaces that commanded it. He said, without turning from the tablets, that this room was the source of the pulse. She said yes. She said that very few people were aware this room existed, that it had been here since before the castle, or rather that the castle had been built around it, that the founders had discovered it in the process of selecting the site for Hogwarts, and had built the school where they built it, partly because of what this room was. She said that 3 of the 4 had subsequently decided that the room should be sealed, that access to it should be restricted to the headmaster and 1 or 2 senior staff, that it should not be used as a teaching resource, or made part of the curriculum. Harry said. And Gryffindor. She said. Gryffindor had argued that this room should be the foundation of the school's curriculum. That understanding what was here was more important than anything the school could teach above it. He was overruled. Harry walked to the nearest niche. He stood before the stone tablet on its carved surface and looked at the marks on it. Up close the marks were more complex, more layered. He could see that they were not flat, but had depth, carved in overlapping registers of depth the way a bas-relief had depth, so that the marks cast tiny shadows that changed as the light in the room moved, very slightly and continuously. The light in the room was moving. He reached out and held his hand above the tablet without touching it. The warmth from it was intense, specific, directed upward like a carefully aimed beam, and in the warmth there was information, or something that functioned like information, the impression of meaning below the threshold of language, the same quality as the synchronized pulse at the window, but richer and more complex, layers of it, the way a very old piece of music was layered. The same note sounding in multiple registers simultaneously. He said, still with his hand above the tablet and his back to McGonagall, that these were records. She said yes. He said. Records of the prior tradition. She said yes. He said. Written by Merlin. A pause. Not the pause of uncertainty, but the pause of someone adjusting to the speed at which the person they were talking to was arriving at conclusions. She said. Some of them, yes. Some were older. Not all of what is in this room was written by one person. This represents the accumulated records of the prior tradition as it existed from its earliest known form through to its last recorded practitioner, which brings us to Merlin, and then it ends. The record stops with him. Harry lowered his hand. He turned to look at her. He said. Because he decided to end it. Or because someone ended it for him. She said, very quietly, that the historical record on that question was not clear. He said. The historical record on that question was probably edited, like everything else. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said yes. Probably. He turned back to the tablets. He looked at them in their 12 niches around the circular room, the accumulated weight of them, the thing that was in them that was older than the castle, and older than the skull, and older than most of what the magical world thought of as its own history. He said. I can feel it. The meaning in them. I cannot read it, not yet, but I can feel that there is meaning there. She said that she had expected that. She said that Dumbledore had believed that someone with the prior tradition's capacity would be able to perceive the tablets in a way that other people could not. That for most people who had entered this room, including herself, the tablets were simply very old carved stone. Impressive and significant but effectively illegible. that the marks did not communicate anything beyond their visual complexity. He said, "And for me," she said. "For you, we hope they will be readable. In time. With practice." He turned to look at her again. He said, "That is what this arrangement is. The note on my list." She said yes. She said that she would like to suggest a schedule, with Dumbledore's approval, which she had already secured, by which Harry could come to this room at designated times, outside of class hours, to work with the tablets. She said that neither she nor Dumbledore were in a position to teach him what was here, because neither of them could read it, but that they could provide him with access, and with the context of what was known about the prior tradition from outside sources, the few records that had survived outside of this room. She said that she would like him to understand that this was unprecedented, that they were asking him to do something for which there was no curriculum, no established method, no tested approach. They were asking him to find his own way into something that no one alive had navigated before. He said, "And if I find my way into it and cannot find my way back out?" She looked at him steadily. She said, "That is a risk we take seriously. Dumbledore will be monitoring your progress carefully. If at any point there are signs that the engagement with the tablets is causing harm rather than development, we will stop immediately," he said. "And I have a say in that decision," she said. "You have a significant say in that decision. This is your capacity, Mr. Potter. We are not directing you to do anything. We are offering you access and support. What you do with it is, ultimately, your own navigation." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the 12 nights of the dream he had had since arriving at Hogwarts, the forest and the stone floor, and the voice getting progressively closer, the single word it had finally said, "Wait." He thought about the fact that he had been waiting his whole life for the context in which to begin, and the context was here now, in a circular room below a castle on a Scottish hill, with carved tablets on carved surfaces and a dome overhead covered in marks that were almost language. He said, "I would like to start next Saturday if that is possible." She said it was possible. She said she would make the relevant arrangements. He said, "One more question." She waited. He said, "The third floor corridor. What is in it?" She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complex enough to contain several things at once, including the wariness of someone who had been hoping this question would come later rather than now, and the resignation of someone who had known it would come precisely this early. She said, "Something that Dumbledore is keeping safe. Something that required a location with significant protective power, and which was placed in a corridor that had, for reasons related to the room we are standing in, a history of strong magical resonance." Harry thought about this. He thought about the pulse he had felt in the third floor corridor, and the way it differed from the pulse in this room. Same family but different quality, like a conversation with someone you did not know in a language you did not speak but could identify. He said, "The resonance in the third floor corridor is related to this room." She said, carefully, that the castle had corridors and spaces that were more strongly connected to the room's influence than others, that the deep structure, as she understood it from Dumbledore's research, was not evenly distributed through the castle's architecture, but followed certain lines through the stone, lines that corresponded approximately to the castle's earliest construction. He said, "Like veins." She paused. She looked at him. She said, with a slight adjustment in her expression that he read as something arriving that had not been expected, "Yes. Like veins." He nodded. He looked around the room one more time, the dome and the niches and the tablets and the living light in the walls. He said, "I will see you next Saturday, then. 8 o'clock. She said 8 o'clock. He went back up the stairs and through the office and out into the castle's ordinary corridors, and the contrast was enormous, not dramatic but profound. The way stepping out of deep water was profound, the sudden return of the ordinary weight of air. He walked back toward the tower. The corridors were beginning to fill with the Saturday morning movement of students, the later risers of Gryffindor and Ravenclaw, making their way to breakfast. He passed Percy Weasley, Ron's older brother, who was a prefect, and moved through the halls, with the particular authority of someone who had waited a long time for institutional backing, and was now making thorough use of it. He passed a group of second-year Hufflepuffs going the other direction. He passed the third floor corridor junction. He stopped. Just for a second. He stood at the junction and felt the pulse there, which was stronger now that he had been in the room, now that he had stood at the source and let it resound through him. He felt it in the third floor corridor, the specific quality of it, and he understood now that it was not the object in the corridor that was creating the resonance. The resonance was in the corridor's stone, and had been there long before whatever Dumbledore had placed there. The object was in the corridor because the corridor was already a place of power, already marked by the lines that ran through the castle's deepest structure. He moved on. He went to breakfast. He sat with Ron and ate and said very little, which Ron, being Ron, compensated for with sufficient conversation for both of them, talking about Quidditch and the weekend, and whether Neville had managed to recover his toad again, who had developed what appeared to be a suicidal interest in exploring the upper floors of the tower. Harry ate and listened and said enough to keep the conversation alive, without contributing anything that required him to be fully present. He was thinking about the tablets, about the marks on them and the warmth of the information in the warmth of the stone, and the fact that he had been able to feel meaning in them, not read it, but feel it, which was the same relationship he had with the deep structure generally, the sense of something that was meaningful in a register below language. He thought about what learning to read it would require. He thought about the phrase Dumbledore had underlined, the capacity to perceive and hold the deep structure without being dissolved by it. He thought that reading the tablets would probably require something similar to what he had done at the window on his first night, the stillness, the sustained attention, the discipline of holding himself present in the experience without being overwhelmed by it. He was good at that. He had been practicing it his whole life, in the cupboard and at Privet Drive, and in every situation that it required him to be present in something difficult without being dissolved by it. He had not known that was what he was practicing. He was beginning to understand that a great deal of what his childhood had required of him had been, unknowingly, preparation for exactly this. He was not grateful for the childhood. He was not going to revise it into something with a purpose in order to make it bearable in retrospect. But he was going to use what it had given him. That seemed like the right response. Hermione appeared at his elbow. She sat down with her breakfast and a book she was reading simultaneously, which she had perfected to a degree that Harry respected as an art form, and she gave him a look that was a question in the form of a look, the question being where have you been and what have you found out. He gave her the fraction of a smile that was the answer he was currently prepared to give, which was not yet, but getting there. She pursed her lips slightly and went back to her book. She was patient in the way that systematic thinkers were patient, unwillingly but completely. The afternoon was his own. He took it to the library, as usual, but today he was not looking for more absent citations or absent bibliographic trails. He was looking for something specific. He pulled a survey of medieval wandless magic traditions from the lower stacks, the book he had bought in Diagon Alley, and that Hermione had also bought, and he sat with it, and read it with the new context of what he had seen in the circular room. The book discussed wandless magic in terms that were clearly filtered through the perspective of the suppression, the institutional decision to treat the prior tradition as a historical footnote, rather than a living practice. The author, a wizard of the 14th century named Albert Pemberton, had access to some of the source material, but not all of it, and the book's awareness of its own limitations was one of its most useful qualities. The places where Pemberton said, "I cannot find any record of how this was actually done, but only that it was done," were precisely the gaps that corresponded to the edited material. What Harry was looking for was anything about the learning process, how someone who had the capacity came to use it. Not the theoretical description of what the prior tradition was, but the practical description of how a practitioner developed their relationship with it. He found 3 relevant passages, buried in chapters that concerned themselves with other primary topics, and deployed this information as supporting context rather than focus. The first said, "The old masters describe a process of progressive attunement, by which they mean not learning in the conventional sense, but a deepening of the practitioner's ability to be still within the deep structure's current, to hold their position without being swept. The early stages of this process are characterized by involuntary expression, the deep structure manifesting through the practitioner without deliberate intention, and the development of practice consists, in this early stage, of learning to recognize when this is happening, and to neither suppress it, nor allow it to overwhelm the practitioner's own coherence." Harry read this several times. He thought about the charms lesson and the potions lesson and the third floor corridor junction. He thought about involuntary expression. He thought about learning to recognize when it was happening. He was, it appeared, already in the early stages. The involuntary expressions were the incidents in class, the moments when the deep structure engaged with the formal spellwork and did something additional. The task was not to make these stop happening, and not to let them happen without control, but to develop awareness of them. To know, in real time, when the deep structure was engaged and what it was doing. He wrote this in the right-hand page of his notebook, in his coded shorthand. He wrote, "Early stage is recognition. Develop awareness before developing control." The second passage said, "The relationship between the practitioner and the deep structure is not a relationship between a person and a tool. It is closer to the relationship between a person and a very large and very old aspect of the world, which has its own logic and its own patterns, and which will not be commanded, but which will respond to genuine presence. The practitioners who attempted to command the deep structure invariably came to grief. The practitioners who developed the capacity to be genuinely present to it, to hold themselves within its logic without imposing their own, were the ones who achieved any lasting understanding." He read this and thought about the synchronized pulse at the window, the moment when his heartbeat and the castle's heartbeat had aligned. He thought about what that had required of him: stillness, attention, the absence of intention, or at least the absence of imposed intention. He had not decided to synchronize with the castle's pulse. He had simply held himself still enough that it happened. He wrote, "Do not command. Be present. Let it come to you." The third passage said, "The marks that the old masters used to record the prior tradition's knowledge were not a writing system, in the sense we now use the term. They were not a fixed code by which sounds were mapped to visual forms. They were a direct inscription of the deep structure's own patterns, the marks representing not sounds or words but states, configurations of the deep structure's underlying logic. To read them required not decoding but attunement, the same capacity that allowed a practitioner to perceive the deep structure in the world. If the practitioner could hold the deep structure in awareness, the marks would speak in the same register, below the threshold of language, in the way that the deep structure itself communicated." Harry set the book down. He sat in a library in the gray afternoon light with the book on the table before him, and thought about what the 3 passages together implied. He was in the early stages of a process that had no curriculum and no teacher, or at least no teacher who was further along the path than he was. He had to develop awareness of the involuntary expressions. He had to practice genuine presence in the deep structure without trying to impose his will on it. And the tablets in the room below McGonagall's office would become readable not through decoding but through attunement, the same attunement he was developing in everything else. It was all the same practice. Every aspect of it was the same practice. He thought about next Saturday. He thought about the dome and the niches and the warmth in the stone. He thought, I have to learn to be still enough that it speaks. He was good at being still. He had been practicing that his whole life too. The week between his visit to McGonagall and his first proper session in the room below was the most carefully managed week of Harry's life at Hogwarts to date. He attended every class. He performed every practical exercise with the correct technique and the correct result, holding the deep structure back from the edges of his formal spellwork, with the new awareness he was developing, the awareness of when it was engaging, and the developing ability to hold a kind of interior steadiness that kept the engagement from spilling into the visible result. He was not entirely successful at this. The Wingardium Leviosa produced its brief displacement again on Tuesday, and in herbology on Thursday the devil's snare specimen he was working with made a sound, not the struggling sound of a plant responding to ordinary stimuli, but a different sound, low and organic and almost communicative, that made Professor Sprout stop what she was doing and stare at it for several seconds, before concluding that it was the draft from the greenhouse windows. It was not the draft from the greenhouse windows. Harry knew that and kept it off his face and moved on. He worked on being still. He practiced it in the evenings, sitting in the armchair by the fire in the common room, while Ron and the others made their ordinary comfortable noise around him, holding himself in the quality of stillness he had used at the window, the stillness that was not absence of attention, but its intensification, all the way down through the stone of the chair and the floor and the castle foundations to the source, keeping the connection just at the threshold of awareness, neither pushing into it nor pulling away, building the discipline of it. He thought of it like learning to hold a note. A musician learning to sustain a sound for longer and longer intervals, developing the physical capacity and the mental focus to hold the sound steady without it wandering flat or sharp or simply stopping. He was learning to hold the awareness of the deep structure steady for longer intervals without it overwhelming his other functions or dropping below the threshold of perception. He noticed, by Wednesday, that his awareness of the pulse in different parts of the castle was becoming more precise. He could feel, as he walked the corridors between classes, not just the general fact of the pulse, but its specific intensity and quality in different locations. The corridors built on the original Hell's bedrock were stronger than the later additions. The room below McGonagall's office was the strongest point. The third-floor corridor junction was a secondary strong point. There were two others he had not yet explored, one in the lower east tower, and one in what appeared to be the vicinity of the Great Hall's eastern wall. The castle was, he was beginning to understand, mapped. Not in the way that school maps mapped rooms and corridors, but in the way that the carved marks on the dome mapped the deep structure, in patterns that had meaning and direction, and that represented a geography of power which underlay the visible geography of stone. He began sketching this in the right-hand pages of his notebook. Not in the coded shorthand, but in a careful diagram, the castle's basic layout as he had it memorized, overlaid with what he was beginning to think of as the pulse map, the distribution and intensity of the deep structure, as he could feel it from his daily movement through the building. By Friday the diagram was detailed enough to be useful. He could see a pattern in it. The strongest points were not random. They formed a shape, an irregular polygon drawn on the castle's floor plan by the placement of significant pulse locations, and at the center of the polygon was the room below McGonagall's office. The castle had been built around the polygon. The polygon was the reason for the castle's shape, the reason the east tower was where it was, and the Great Hall was where it was, and the third-floor corridor ran the direction it ran. The castle had been built to contain and protect the shape in the stone, the shape that was itself a map of the deep structure's distribution through the hill. He sat with his diagram on Friday night, and thought about what this meant about the people who had built the castle. He thought about what it meant to build a building around a pattern of the earth's deep magic, and then to suppress the knowledge that the pattern existed. He thought that the three founders who had decided on suppression had not suppressed it out of simple fear. They had suppressed it out of a specific fear of people who understood exactly what they were hiding, and were terrified of what would happen if it was found. He thought. But it was always going to be found again. You cannot suppress the deep structure. You can only delay the conversation. He was going to be part of that conversation. He was already part of it. Saturday arrived. He was at McGonagall's door at 8 o'clock. She took him down the stairs in silence. The pulse rose through him with each step downward, familiar now, a known sensation, and he moved into it as a practiced swimmer moved into current, with his body inclined toward it rather than resistant, letting it organize around him, rather than trying to part it. She left him at the door of the circular room. She said that she would return in 2 hours, and that if at any point before that he needed to leave, he should leave and come to find her. She said it not as an instruction but as a practical offer, the way you told a person where the door was in a room that was unusual and might become overwhelming. He said he understood. She went back up the stairs. He stood in the circular room alone for the first time, and let the pulse move through him fully, not managing it, not holding it at threshold, but letting it come at its natural intensity, which was considerable. He stood in the center of the room and breathed and felt the deep structure all around him, in the floor and the walls and the dome overhead, and he was a human body standing in the middle of something that was enormously larger than a human body. The way you stood in the middle of an old forest, and felt the scale of it, all that presence that was not hostile and not welcoming, but simply immensely itself. He looked up at the dome. The carved marks were clear today. Or rather, his capacity to see them was clear. He could see the layering he had noticed on his first visit, the overlapping registers of depth, and he could see now that the layers were not random but sequential, that the marks at the deepest level were older than the marks at the surface level, that the dome had been carved at multiple times by multiple hands, each addition to the record inscribed over the previous at a slightly shallower depth. He moved to the nearest niche. He stood before the stone tablet and held his hand above it at the same height as before, and felt the warmth and the information in the warmth. He held himself still. He breathed. He focused his awareness the way he had been practicing, all the way down through the ordinary registers of sensation to the deep structural one, the one that was below the threshold of his ordinary senses, but that he had been developing access to. He held it there for a long time. He did not try to read the marks. He did not impose intention on the tablet or on himself. He simply held himself present in the deep structure, genuinely present, as the book had said, not commanding but genuinely there, and let the tablet be what it was, and let the communication happen or not happen at its own speed, and in its own register. It did not happen immediately. He had not expected it to. He stood with his hand above the tablet for perhaps 20 minutes, holding his stillness, maintaining his presence without forcing it, and felt only the warmth and the impression of meaning, the same as before, no more specific. Then he moved to the next niche. He did the same thing. And the next. He moved around the room, spending 15 to 20 minutes at each niche, not because he expected to crack it open on the first visit, but because the practice itself was the point. He was building attunement. He was developing the capacity to be genuinely present to what was in this room, and that required time and repetition, and a willingness to be a beginner. He was, for the first time in his experience of being a beginner at something, entirely comfortable with it. At the 8th niche, something shifted. He was standing with his hand above the tablet, and his awareness held steady in the deep structure, and the tablet did something different from what the others had done. Not dramatically. Not with the explosive theatrics of a spell gone wrong. It did something very quiet that was also very complete. The warmth from it changed. Shifted in quality, became more specific, more directed, and in the direction of the quality he was holding in his awareness, as though the tablet were reaching toward the precise register of his attention, rather than simply radiating generally. And in that directed contact, something that was not quite language and not quite image and not quite sound, but that contained elements of all three arrived in his awareness. It was brief, a fraction of a second's worth of communication, and he could not have said afterward exactly what it had conveyed, only that it had conveyed something, that something had passed between the tablet and the place in him where the deep structure lived, something that had the quality of a first word in a conversation that had been waiting to begin for a very long time. He stepped back. He stood in the middle of the room and breathed. He looked at his hands. They were not shaking. He checked, because the intensity of what he had felt for that fraction of a second had been considerable, and he wanted to know whether his body's response was matching the experience's scale. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. He was present and intact and not dissolved. The capacity to perceive and hold the deep structure without being dissolved by it. He was holding it. He was not dissolved. He went back to the 8th tablet. He held his hand above it again. He waited. It happened again, slightly longer this time, the directed warmth and the fragment of communication, and this time he could almost identify what it had said. Not in words. And something below words, a configuration that meant something the way a chord meant something, that carried an emotional and conceptual weight that was not quite translatable into language, but that pointed at something language could approach. It pointed at beginning. The concept of beginning. The first thing, the first moment, the fact of something starting that had not existed before its start. He stood at the 8th tablet and thought about this. He thought about it with the deep structural part of his awareness still open, still present, and the tablet responded to his thinking about it by offering the configuration again, slightly more fully, slightly more completely. Beginning. And something else alongside it. Something that was paired with beginning the way a musical note was paired with its harmonic, the same note at a different pitch, related by ratio, rather than by identity. The thing paired with beginning was return. Beginning and return. The beginning that was also return. The first thing that was also, in some sense, the thing coming back. He felt this arrive in his awareness with the completeness of understanding that bypassed the ordinary steps, the understanding that was not the conclusion of an argument, but the apprehension of a fact. He was a beginning, and he was a return. He was the first of something new, and he was the coming back of something very old. He stood in the circular room below Hogwarts Castle on a Saturday morning in his first term, and understood, for the first time with the full weight of it, what he was. Not the details, not the implications, not the practical and dangerous reality of what it meant to carry the prior tradition in a world that had spent 900 years forgetting it existed. But the fact of it, the essential fact. He was what came after the long silence. He was where the deep structure had been heading while it waited, while the magical world built its skulls and its wands and its standardized spells and its institutional structures over the top of the thing it had decided to bury. He was the conversation that could not be suppressed indefinitely, because the deep structure was patient in a way that human institutions were not, and it had been waiting in the stone of this hill and the stone of this room for the particular person who could hold it without being dissolved by it. He had arrived. McGonagall came back 2 hours later and found him sitting cross-legged in the center of the room with his hands in his lap and his eyes open, and an expression on his face that she looked at for a long moment before saying anything. She said, "Are you all right?" He said, "Yes." He said it with the quiet certainty of someone who has just measured themselves against something enormous and found, to their own careful surprise, that they were adequate to it. She looked at him for another moment. She said, "What happened?" He said, "I made contact with one of the tablets." He said it simply, as a fact. He said, "It will take time and practice to develop any real fluency. But I understand now how the process works. I know what I am doing." She looked at him in the way she had looked at him in the kitchen at Privet Drive, the careful look with knowledge behind it. But there was something additional in it now, something she had not been carrying on that first meeting. Something that was not quite certainty and not quite awe, but that contained elements of both. She said, "Good." She said it with the precision of someone to whom that word carried more weight than it usually carried. He stood up. He brushed the stone dust off his robes. He looked around the room one more time, the dome and the niches and the tablets and the living light. He said, "Same time next week." She said, "Same time next week." He went up the stairs and through the office and out into the castle, which was full of ordinary Saturday morning life, students in the corridors and the smell of breakfast from the great hall below, and the pulse in the stone around him. The pulse he had been feeling since he was small enough to have slept in a cupboard under the stairs, was the same as it always was, steady and deep and patient. But he heard it differently now. He heard it the way you heard a piece of music differently once you understood what it was building toward. With the knowledge of the shape it was making, the enormous slow architecture of what it was doing. It was building toward him. It had always been building toward him. He walked back to the tower to find Ron and Hermione and the ordinary Saturday of his first year at Hogwarts, and he was 11 years old and carrying something older than the skull and heavier than its stones, and he held it with the particular steadiness of someone who had been practicing, without knowing it, his whole life. He was a beginning. He was a return. He was ready to learn what that meant. Thanks for watching my video.